Silent. Thank you. My name is Councillor Nick Stavrou and I chair this committee. The Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting is being live streamed on Council website to enable public viewing of proceedings, including councillor deliberations and voting. The meeting is also being recorded and will be made available on the Council website as soon as practicable after the meeting. Should technical problems be encountered during the meeting will be adjourned until the problem is rectified, or if needed, the meeting will be postponed. I will start by introducing my fellow councillors and officers. Seated to my left at the horseshoe table in the council chamber are Councillor Jim Park, Councillor Cynthia Watson, Councillor Felicity Sinfield, who's also the Mayor, Councillor Wes Gold, Councillor Di Gillies. On the opposite side we have Councillor Lisa Hollingsworth, who's also our Deputy Mayor, Councillor Gary Thompson, Councillor Jane Addis, Councillor Susan Bigger, and Councillor Victor Franco. I also acknowledge our CEO, Mr. Philip Storer, who's seated behind Councillor Gold, and our Director of Urban Living, Mr. Scott Walker, to my right. To my left, I acknowledge Manager of Governance and Legal, Mr. Brian Wee. There are other officers in attendance tonight, and they will be introduced as they present their reports. The primary purpose of the Urban Delegated Planning Committee is to deal with issues under the Planning and Environment Act and Building Act. This committee has delegated authority to make decisions on behalf of Council. Councillors are familiar with each report, which includes a summary of the objections received. For those in the gallery presenting this evening, when we come to the agenda item, it will be introduced by an officer. I will then call you one by one to come forward and address the committee. If you're making a submission, please present your viewpoints clearly and concisely on why you support or oppose the planning application. Please do not repeat what earlier speakers have said and keep the submission focused on relevant issues and points not previously raised. If you are opposed to the planning application, please tell the committee why you disagree and suggest an alternative approach that would satisfy your concerns. Please focus on your concerns rather than matters of history or detail in the officer's report. There is a strict limit of 3 minutes for each speaker, including councillors. And whilst as chair I can vary that time, I will seldom do. I will ask the speakers to stand at the top of the horseshoe table, and I will invite those against the report to speak first, followed by those in favour. At the 2.5 minute mark, I will mark it by making a sound indicating that you have 30 seconds remaining to conclude your presentation. Are there any apologies, Mr. Wee?
Through you, Chair, there are no apologies this evening.
Councillors, can I please have a motion to adopt and confirm the minutes of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee of the 5th of December 2022? Councillor Thompson.
Happy to move those minutes.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson. Councillor Hollingsworth.
Happy to second, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hollingsworth. Do I have, councillors, is there anybody opposed to this? If there's been no opposition, I'll declare the motion carried. Councillors and council officers, are there any conflicts of interest that need to be declared? There appear to be no conflicts of interest. Thank you. We now move to the substantive part of the business of the meeting, and we move to item 3.1, amendment of C367 Borough 57 and 60 Barclay Street, Hawthorn, Heritage Overlay, consideration of panel report. Mr. Emil Dixon, Strategic Planner, will be presenting the report. Mr. Dixon, please.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, councillors, officers and attendees. Amendment C367 seeks to apply the heritage overlay to 57 and 60 Berkeley Street in Hawthorn. On the 1st of August 2022, a report was considered by the Urban Planning Delegated Committee on the outcomes of the exhibition process for Amendment C367, which ran from May until June in 2022. Through the exhibition process, 33 submissions were received, with 31 submissions in support of heritage protection and 2 submissions objecting to heritage protection. Key issues raised in the submissions related to the perceived intactness of the properties, the findings of earlier heritage studies in the area, and the ability of the properties to meet the requisite criteria for inclusion under the heritage overlay. The UPDC resolved to refer the amendment to an independent planning panel for consideration. The planning panel process was undertaken between September and October 2022, and the panel report was received by officers on the 25th of November 2022. The independent planning panel supports the inclusion of 57 and 60 Berkeley Street, Hawthorn in the heritage overlay. Regarding 57 Berkeley Street, Hawthorn specifically, the panel supports Council's submission that the 1995 addition to the home does not detract from the overall intactness of the house. While the panel formed the view that criterion E, or aesthetic significance, was not met, it concluded that criterion D, representativeness, was met. It should be noted that only one criterion needs to be met to warrant inclusion in the heritage overlay. Regarding 60 Berkeley Street, Hawthorn specifically, the panel accepted Council's submission and the evidence of its expert, which was not challenged at the hearing. That 60 Berkeley Street, Hawthorn was individually significant. The panel did not recommend any changes. In summation, the panel recommended adoption of Amendment C367, subject to minor changes in relation to 57 Berkeley Street, Hawthorn heritage citation, which is outlined in the UPDC report. And officers recommend accepting the panel's recommendation. Officers recommend the UPDC resolve to receive and acknowledge the panel's report as it relates to Amendment C367 and refer the amendment to an ordinary meeting of Council for adoption. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Dixon. We have 3 speakers wishing to make submissions on this item. There are 2 speakers that will make personal submissions, and 1 I have been asked to read the submission out for them. I would like first to call upon Ailsa Wilson, Mrs. Ailsa Wilson, to come to the horseshoe table when you can. And I will call the next speaker as well to ensure that we have good flow of the meeting. Mr. Brian Keon Cohen will be the next speaker. Thank you. Ms. Wilson, could you please commence with your name and suburb, followed by your presentation? As I've said earlier, we have 3 minutes. On the 2.5-minute mark, I will make the sound of the bell.
Thank you. I'm Ailsa Wilson from Kooyonkoot Road, back to back with number 57 Berkeley Street. And tonight I'm joined by many neighbours from particularly Berkeley Street and the Tuckwell family, and people who have lived and had significant connections with the house, with Jan Dimmick and Brian Keon Cohen. Number 57, Chesney Wold, does tell an important story about the development of Hawthorn under criteria D. The residents and neighbours have intuitively understood this, and they've enjoyed this Federation villa, purposely built in a large garden setting over a double block. We walk past and we see the distinctive L-shaped return veranda presented with its asymmetrical front garden to enhance the view from the street. We see that it was built around 1918, towards the end of the World War I, and that they would have done the best they could have during the war with the resources available to build this period home in a Federation style. We see that it was sited as one of the first properties south of Calentina and south of Riversdale Road, angled to take advantage of the Green Hill down to Gardners Creek and the Yarra River that would have been uninterrupted at the time. It was on a large garden allotment that was considered a healthy way to live, surrounded by gardens, trees and fresh air, with the new trams making it possible to also access jobs in Richmond and the city. Over the years, that large garden space has also allowed croquet lawns, tennis court, a swimming pool, a playhouse, adventure playgrounds, and many have been invited in the community to functions there to share in the gardens and the beauty. We're lucky that we know the details of this story because we still have Jan Dimmick, who's with me today, who's 95, who for 20 years visited that house while her best girlfriend lived there and knew it well and recalls it as it is. And also Brian Keon Cohen, who lived there for the next 20 years, and he will speak next. They've told us about their personal experiences. Thank you to Council for listening to over the 2,400 people in the community who signed the petition to save number 57. Because of Council's actions, with the architects of Peter Barrett and Sue Silberberg, and the actions with the independent panel, we now have the technical language to understand why the story of 57 does so carefully illustrate the history of Hawthorn.
Thank you, Mrs. Wilson. Your time has expired. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right on the dot as well. Councillors, are there any questions for Mrs. Wilson? There have been no further questions. Thank you for your submission. You may return to your seat in the gallery. Thank you very much. I would like now to call upon Dr. Brian Keon-Cohen to the horseshoe table. Thank you. Could you please commence with your name and your suburb? Thank you. And you have 3 minutes as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Brian Keon-Cohen. I reside at 49 Burke Road, East Malvern. And I'm here to speak to you regarding the reports before you concerning 57 Berkeley Street. I lived at 57 Berkeley Street from the age of 6 until my 20s, 1950 through to the mid-1960s. We had a wonderful experience there in a house, extensive garden with many community activities, and I'm here to support the proposed heritage citation in regard to criterion D. I support and refer to my prior submissions made in September 22 to the planning panel, and I refer also and support Ms. Wilson's submissions that you've just heard. I also support the submissions of Mr. Neil Young, KC. A document, I understand, was emailed to Mr. M.L. Dixon this afternoon and is now held by you, Mr. Chairman, or your officers. I have read that document. It speaks of overwhelming community support, speaks of significance of that support, and refers to the independent experts, Mr. Barrett and Mr. Silberg. I've read those reports and I support those conclusions. May I also thank you, Mr. Chairman, your fellow councillors and officers of the council for the significant work that's been pursued to get this issue to the stage that it's at now. The recommendations of the planning panel and of the council officers to apply the revised heritage citation protecting the house is, I think, an appropriate movement, fully supported by the community, and does a service to the local area, maintaining an attractive house and also maintaining an historical period that gives great, I think, satisfaction and support to the local community. Mr. Chairman, those are my submissions. I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Keon-Cohen. Councillors, are there any questions for Dr. Keon-Cohen? There be no further questions. Please return to the gallery. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I have received an extra resident wishing to speak. Thank you very much. It is it's Ms. Rosemary Blandon. Please come towards the horseshoe table. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please commence with your name and suburb, and you have 3 minutes.
My name's Rosemary Blandon. I live at Auburn Road, Hawthorn. I've been involved in this, supporting this amendment from the very beginning. I think it's a very good example of the passion of the community for saving the, preserving our history and the beauty of our city of Burundara. And I fully support the panel's recommendations and the officer's interpretation of the panel submissions 50, 57 and 60 Barclay Street. I think it's important to recognise that, as Elsa said, the petition that was signed by 2,500 people supporting the preservation of this house, the 54 submissions of local residents and the 31 supporting submissions for the most recent exhibition. As well as members of the community attending the planning panels. It's quite an onerous exercise on the part of the community, and it requires a lot of effort, and it's good that the council have recognised that and have taken on board the panel's submissions. I think it's also important to note that 60 Barclay Street was not included in the original gap study, and the fact that it is now recommended as individually significant is extremely significant in that part of the process of demolition at the moment allows for, or doesn't allow for, houses that were not part of the original gap study to be considered for heritage consideration. So I think that's something that needs to be reviewed in view of the planning panels and the expert opinions on 60 Barclay Street. And without the community raising these issues, that house would be demolished. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Bland. Ms. Blandon, are there any questions for Ms. Blandon? There have been no new questions. You can present the gallery. Thank you, Ms. Blandon. We move to the last resident wishing to speak, but as I said, the fourth resident would like me to read the statement for them. So this is the statement from Mr. Neil Young. I have received an invitation to attend the Urban Planning Delegated Committee this afternoon, but unfortunately I have other professional commitments. My property backs onto 57 Barclay Street. I strongly support the recommendation by the council officers to adopt the revised heritage citation for 57 Barclay Street, Hawthorn, as recommended by the planning panel. In this report dated 25 November 2022. Further, I support the recommendation that the heritage citation for 57 Barclay Street should be adopted by the council at its next meeting. After careful consideration, following extensive submissions and evidence, the planning panel correctly concluded that 57 Barclay Street satisfied criterion D for heritage protection. It is an individually significant heritage property that is important in demonstrating the principal characteristics of the early settlement of Hawthorn, south of Riversdale Road. I would also stress the following features of the planning appeal process that culminated in the decision of the planning panel. A, overwhelming community support. The Heritage Amendment had overwhelming community support. The only opposition came from the self-interested property owner who acquired the property on the 16th of September 2021. I should strike out the word self-interested, I would say, when it was already the subject of a heritage investigation. Community support is indicated by the fact that 2,400 members of the local community petitioned the council for a heritage review. The community filed 54 submissions in support of the granted heritage protection when the matter was first before council. Another 3 supporting submissions were filed in exhibition of the amendment, and the panel received 26 submissions supporting the amendment to confer heritage protection on 57 Barclay Street. At all stages, the only opposing submission came from the owner of the property. Significance. Part B. The heritage protection rules are designed to protect and conserve buildings and places of aesthetic, architectural, historical, cultural and/or social significance. Social and cultural significance refers to the shared attitudes, values and goals of the relevant community, as powerfully demonstrated by the almost universal community support for the heritage protection of this property. And finally, both of these experts, Mr. Bartlett and Dr. Silverbird, both of these experts undertook an in-depth, independent and open-minded assessment of the heritage significance of 57 Barclay Street. Indeed, they were the only experts who carried out a reasoned, holistic assessment of the combined aesthetic, architectural and historical features of the 57 Barclay Street property, and they strongly supported its protection. Moreover, they each concluded quite rightly that the 1995 edition did not detract from or affect the individual heritage significance of 57 Barclay Street. This view was endorsed by the panel. Then we have finished with the speakers. After the presenters, are there any matters arising?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to those who've addressed the UPDC on this matter this evening, but we don't have anything to add regarding this item. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So, councillors, are there any questions for the officers? There be no questions. Councillors, is anybody prepared to move a motion? Councillor Biggar.
Yes, I'd like to move the officer's recommendation, please.
Thank you, Councillor Biggar. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Sinfield.
Happy to.
Thank you. To assist the mover, is there anybody opposed to the motion? There be no opposition. Councillor Biggar, as the mover, do you wish to speak to your motion?
I do briefly, if I may. I have to say it's such a pleasure to be able to speak to this report tonight. I firstly do want to thank the officers for their hard work and professionalism with this report over several years now. And I will make this brief because it's certainly not the first time we have discussed these two homes, 57 and 60 Barclay Street. In the past few years, it's come up a number of times, and in fact, it's been a long and complex journey, particularly for 57. But these houses represent the rich history and the culture, the architectural beauty of Hawthorne. And the city's history holds enormous value to our community. It's a shared history. It's about our sense of place and something that I think all of us know that our community really wants us to preserve. We hear about it time and time again. But the one thing I really would like to do is to, again, give credit for this heritage citation to the hard work and the persistence of the local residents who were concerned, particularly about 57. They have dedicated many hours to researching the history of it. They have written many emails, including a fair few to me. They've constructed submissions, they've attended planning panels, and they have supported heritage protection for this home over a number of years now. I think all of this work has been confirmed by the findings of the planning panel, forming the view that both 57 and 60 Barclay Street are worthy of heritage protection and are to be seen as individually significant homes. So I think this is an important outcome, and it's one to be celebrated, and I would encourage my fellow councillors to support the officer's recommendation, which takes us the next step to bring this matter to upcoming ordinary council meeting. So thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Biggar. Councillor Sinfield, there's a second. Do you wish to make any comments?
No, thank you, Chair. I don't believe it's opposed. Thank you.
Thank you. There be no opposition. I will now put the motion. All those in favour? All those against? I think it's a unanimous decision. Thank you very much. Motion is carried. Now we move to our next item, which is item 3.2, Amendment C 368 Borough 32 Corby Street, Balwyn North. Consideration of panel report. I have with us Ms. Michaela Carter, who will be presenting the report. Thank you, Ms. Carter.
Thank you, Chair. This evening's report is to inform the committee of the recommendations of the Independent Planning Panel appointed to consider submissions to Amendment C 368 and to consider the officer's recommendation to abandon the amendment. The amendment proposes to include 32 Corby Street, Balwyn North in the Heritage Overlay on a permanent basis. Exhibition of the amendment was carried out between the 5th of May and the 6th of June 2022. A total of 11 submissions were received. 6 of the 11 submissions supported the Heritage Overlay and 4 were opposed. 1 submitted the Department of Transport did not object to the amendment. The key concerns raised in opposing submissions were issues with the existing building, including livability and the structural condition, limitations on the future redevelopment of the site, negative personal impacts, including financial and emotional costs, and most relevantly, disagreement with the assessment against criteria on E, arguing that the house is unremarkable and not of aesthetic significance, and disagreement with the assessment against criteria on H, arguing that the dwelling is not representative of architect Alistair Knox's style, and disputing the importance of Knox to the municipality. At its meeting on the 1st of August 2022, the UPDC resolved to request the appointment of an independent planning panel and to refer all submissions for consideration. An independent planning panel held a hearing over 4 days between the 19th of September and the 27th of October in 2022, also considering Amendment C367 concurrently, as you've just heard. 2 opposing submitters to the amendment were represented as one party at the panel hearing. On the 25th of November 2022, officers received the panel's report, found at attachment 1 of tonight's agenda. The panel's report was made public in accordance with the requirements of the Planning and Environment Act on the 29th of November 2022. The panel has recommended Amendment C368 be abandoned, finding that the thresholds for local significance for the criteria put forward by Council's heritage consultant have not been met. The panel formed the view that the house is an intact but ordinary example of modernist architecture and does not demonstrate any special association with Alistair Knox's main body of work. The panel did not agree with Council's expert witness that Knox, being an architect of state importance, automatically means that the threshold for local significance in Burundara is met. While the recommendation to abandon is not consistent with Council's submission to the panel, officers accept the recommendation as well reasoned. As such, officers recommend that the UPDC resolve to receive and acknowledge the panel's report as it relates to Amendment C368 and to refer the amendment to an ordinary meeting of Council to be abandoned. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Carter. We have two delegated submissions tonight, Dr. Sanjay Vij and Mrs. Jane Vij. I call upon Dr. Sanjay Vij. Thank you, Mr. Vij. Please commence with your name and suburb. You've come straight from work, I can see.
Sanjeev Vij, 32 Corby Street, Baldwin North. Good evening, everyone, council officers and councillors. I refer to UPDC proceedings of 1st August 2022. Council officer proposed that appropriate forum to test the differing professional opinions is at the independent planning panel. Councillor Sinfield, now the mayor, moved the resolution and she quoted, "It's in the interest of fairness, none of us are experts in planning matters. It is appropriate to refer the matter to the panel. The panel will review it and advise us of the outcome," unquote. UPDC passed this motion unanimously with no change to the wording or intent of the motion. Hence, to maintain trust and transparency now, please accept panel's recommendation without caveats. I now refer to panel's rigorous proceedings over 4 days. The panel meticulously tested the evidence. That is what it was sent for. The chair interviewed and also allowed cross-examination of both sides, including most respected heritage firms in the city. The panel concluded, and I quote, "It is not appropriate nor justified to apply heritage overlay to the subject dwelling. The panel recommends to abandon the amendment," unquote. UPDC is now deciding between the binary outcomes of step 8 of heritage process steps. In our matter, both outcomes align. Adopting panel's recommendation leads to abandoning the amendment. Sanctity of the nuanced heritage process does not benefit by activism. Individual views, including those of UPDC members, lack the finesse and the depth and breadth of experience that is required to adjudicate on the heritage matters. For example, I, as an intensive care specialist, may have views on style and structure of a civil engineering project, but my views should not override the conclusions of statutory forum where collective wisdom of experts in the field has been thoroughly tested. Similarly, foundations set up on and run by families are neither the broader community nor they are independent or unbiased. Definitely, it is also not about having them all, as the council expert said at the panel. That would make heritage meaningless. I also request you to listen to community opinion. Council has dozens of signed letters from immediate neighborhood on file rejecting the amendment. The planning department has them. The actual community have views, their opinions matter, they vote. Community opinion aligns with panel's wisdom in our matter. To conclude, UPDCU sent us to the panel. Panel has clearly rejected the amendment. Community overwhelmingly rejects the amendment. Council officers recommend to follow panel's decision as per step 8 of Burundara statutory process. Please abandon the amendment now on a permanent basis and do not reignite heritage process on the subject dwelling in future. I thank you for your time.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr. Viz. Are there any questions for Mr. Viz? If there be no questions, you can return to the gallery. Thank you.
Thank you.
I now call upon Mrs. Jane Viz. Please proceed to the horseshoe table. Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Viz. Please commence with your name and suburb, and you have 3 minutes.
Jane Vidge, 32 Corby Street, Balwyn North is where I live. Evening, councillors and council officers. Independent of each other, two of the most respected and oldest heritage firms in Melbourne find the overlay on 32 Corby is not justified. The reports provided by both these firms are very thorough, detailed, took months to compile. The matter was discussed at partner level. Each firm went through a very thorough process. The independent planning panel underwent an exhaustive, thorough process, comprehensively tested the evidence, and then has found the heritage overlay at 32 Corby is not justified and should be abandoned. Very experienced, skilled Mr. Michael Bullock presided over panel. He took his time, carefully considering all aspects of the matter. Please trust these professional experts, well considered, solid conclusions. The Burundara Council officer asks you to do the same. On 1st of August, councillors asked us to attend the panel to let them decide, as he told us they were the experts. You're right. The expert view is in. The overlay is not justified. This matter has taken 2 years of our lives, caused huge amounts of stress and expense to me and my children and my husband. Enough is enough. Do not listen to false narratives or false nostalgia from those who have dubious motivations. They've had their chance to participate and they should not be listened to now. The community, as Sanjeev said, is also very much on our side that this house should not be part of an overlay. On your website, you promised to act with integrity. Please do so. The panel's very reasoned and sound and thorough professional recommendation is the only conclusion to listen to. Please, enough is enough. We just wish to build a family home, allowing for the avenue-appropriate oak tree at the front, which we will protect. And we'll put in generous further planting with Luna's Landscapes has got the design. The views have gone this block because of what's happened around the block in Balwyn North, yet the views were key. We'll generously green up the block and reveal the views again, put the house right on the back of this elevated block so you get the views of the Yarra Valley again. It will be a stunning house. It will be mid-century from the front with a flat roof, steel square set windows, a beautiful big European designed balcony. It will be absolutely gorgeous. I am the daughter of a mid-century builder. In fact, a lot of the people I've read about in the last 2 years, I have personally met. A lot of them did work for my dad. They were often dinner guests at our table. Please put yourself in the very good company. Dr. Megan Katz, Dr. Claire Miller, the whole team of Lovell Chen, the whole team of Truthowan, are asking you to see the light and not put this heritage overlay. Please abandon the heritage overlay. Mr. Michael Bullock, as well as your own council officer, all of whom urge you to abandon the overlay effective immediately and never return to this matter, please, in regard to 32 Corby Street. Thank you. Jane.
Thank you, Mrs. Viz. Are there any questions for Mrs. Viz? If there be no questions, please return to your seat. Thank you. We have finished now with the presentations. Are there any matters arising?
Thank you, and through you, Chair, I'd firstly like to acknowledge the submitters who took the time to participate in the panel hearing and also to come along and provide verbal presentations for tonight's meeting. In response to tonight's presentations, I reiterate the recommendation of the panel to abandon the amendment and echo that recommendation to the committee. And I also take the time to clarify that the UPDC is unable to abandon the amendment this evening, but rather can resolve to refer the matter to a full meeting of council to be formally abandoned. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Ms. Carter. Are there any questions for Ms. Carter, councillors? Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a follow-up question to the officer. When you say council's determination tonight will not formalise the process, it will then have to go, did you say, to a council meeting?
That's correct. So the resolution this evening would be to refer the matter to a full meeting of council for the formal abandonment of the amendment.
Right. Are you able to advise approximate timeframe of when that would come to council?
We've got it tentatively scheduled for the 27th of February, which is the next available council meeting.
Right, thank you, depending on obviously
Of course,
council
thank you.
determination.
Tentatively, thank you.
There'll be no further questions. Councillors, is anybody prepared to move a motion? Councillor Park.
Thank you, Chair. I move the officer's recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Park. And as a second, I have Councillor Gary Thompson.
Very happy to second that, Mr Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson. Councillor Park, would you like to speak to your... to assist the mover, is there any opposition? Apologies for that. No apologies. Would you like to speak to your mover?
Just very briefly, thank you, Chair. The panel report speaks for itself, and I adopt the officer's recommendation. I don't see it as a case of seeing the light, but the process needed to be run, and I think it's landed where it has, and I accept that, and I'd urge councillors to support the recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Park. Councillor Thompson, as a seconder, would you? Thank you so much. There'll be no opposition. I will put the motion to the vote. Councillors, all those for? It's a unanimous decision. I declare the motion as carried. Thank you very much. I'll just make a couple of words before we go. Look, I understand, Mr. and Mrs. Viz, your concerns, and that's one of the reasons why I gave you that latitude to speak the way that you spoke in your presentation. But as Councillor Park alluded, the process is there for a reason. The process is there so that we can ensure that fairness is done, and it's seen to be done. And I think this process has done that. I will ask briefly Mr. Walker to make a couple of comments for the benefit of the gallery, how a panel can actually achieve or come to a different conclusion than we previously had in the chamber.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Just happy to comment on the process and what has actually happened here. We had a matter which was potential heritage over the property considered by the council through the UPDC, which included advice to the council that there was heritage or potential heritage over the property at 32 Corby Street. And there was also positions put by the property owner and advice provided by the property owner that countered that and took a different position. So we were in a position where the UPDC had different views in relation to whether there was heritage merit for the property. And the UPDC referred the matter to a planning panel to test that evidence further, to test that advice, and to form an independent view and provide a recommendation back to the UPDC for a final decision. And that's an appropriate process for a planning scheme amendment and a heritage type matter. And that will often be the case and often be the steps and the process that occurs that enables all parties to put forward their positions and views and to have that thoroughly tested in an independent way and then an independent advice provided back. And that's exactly what's happened in this case. And you have received that and formed a view on that basis.
Thank you, Mr. Walker, for your comments. Appreciate that. Now we move to the next item, item 3.3 on the agenda, P 220521, 570 Riversdale Road, Camberwell, residential apartment development. I have Ms. Daniela Spitgerber, Senior Urban Planner, presenting the report. Thank you.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chair. I present item number 3.3 for the construction of a 3-storey building plus 2-level basement comprising 15 apartments, construction of a fence, and alteration of access to a road in a Transport Zone 2 for the land at 570 Riversdale Road in Camberwell. The subject site is zoned within the General Residential Zone Schedule 3, which is a moderate growth area that encourages a diversity of housing types and housing growth. The subject site is located on the periphery of the Camberwell Activity Centre and is not affected by a heritage overlay and does not sit within a heritage precinct area. The building will comprise a staggered 2- and 3-storey facade presentation to Riversdale Road. The proposed building will have a maximum height of 10 metres to Riversdale Road, increasing to 11.6 metres to the rear at the south-west corner in response to the slope of the land. The south-east corner of the building height is 10.9 metres. The subject site is sloped towards the rear by approximately 3 metres. The building complies with clause 32.08, the building height requirements, allowing a maximum of 3 storeys and 12-metre height for sloping sites. The application was advertised in October 2022 when notices were sent out to the owners and occupiers of adjoining land and the placing of signs of the land for a period of 2 weeks. A total of 47 objections have now been received. It is noted since the completion of the officer's report that 2 additional objections have been recently received and considered. The objections predominantly relate to the following concerns: the heritage value of the existing building, the impact of the proposal on the significant graded Hatfield flats next door at number 576 Riversdale Road, neighbourhood character, amenity impacts, environmental sustainability, traffic and parking, and the impact on the pin oak tree in the front setback. The subject site is not in a heritage overlay. It was thoroughly assessed by 2 heritage consultants and reached the same conclusion, which was also tested with the independent panel. The Camberwell Heritage Gap Study in August 2018 found that the property did not reach the threshold for individual heritage significance. No heritage precinct was identified in this area. The proposed building adopts a stepped design to minimise its visual prominence to the street and impact on the adjoining properties. This is achieved through varied front and side setbacks, providing a transition in scale and built form to the buildings to the east, west and south. The scheme echoes the varied heights observed at the existing significant graded heritage flats to the east, known as Hatfield. This is consistent with the zone strategies for the character of the area in that the proposed building height and form complements the varied streetscape. It is considered the proposal is consistent with anticipated scale of change within the area. The proposal delivers a mix of 2- and 3-bedroom apartments, each with private open space areas at ground floor or terrace levels, and the apartment building suits a range of households, assisting in contributing to housing diversity in the area. The external finishes provide visual interest and articulate the building to manage visual mass prominence from the front, side and rear elevations. Council's urban designer describes the design concept as a well-conceived and executed architectural scheme that contributes positively to the streetscape and wider public realm. The proposed development complies with the objectives and the requirements in relation to daylight to existing windows, north-facing windows overshadowing open space and overlooking standards. It achieves a total BESS score of 59%, which is above the best practice standards requiring a minimum of 50%. Council's Environment Sustainable Developer Officer has reviewed the project and found it to be acceptable. Car parking is provided within 2 basement levels containing 40 car spaces. The allocation of car parking spaces complies with the requirements of clause 5206, which is car parking of the planning scheme. The basement will be accessed via a new 6.1 metre double-wide crossover adjacent to the eastern boundary. The existing pin oak tree within the front northwestern corner is to be retained. This tree is considered to be high retention value, contributing to the amenity and ecological significance of the area. The oak tree is a prominent feature within the streetscape and therefore the building footprint has been sympathetically designed to ensure it is retained and protected. Substantial setbacks have been provided, particularly to the western portion of the building, to ensure the tree is not adversely impacted and it's preserved. It is recommended that Council issue a notice of decision to grant a planning permit subject to the conditions detailed in the report. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Plitgerber. We have 11 speakers wishing to speak tonight, 10 of which are against, 9 of which will speak, 1 will not speak, and 1 for. Now let me call first Mrs. Annette Cooper, followed by Miss Anna Karina. Annette Cooper. Please commence with your name and suburb, followed by your presentation. You have 3 minutes.
Hello, Annette Cooper, Camberwell. In the agenda for this meeting, it says that officers have assessed the application against all relevant policies and planning scheme requirements. It seems, however, that Council's climate change and landfill policies haven't been fully factored in. Firstly, all stages of the construction process, from demolition to transport of materials, to decomposition of any organic matter in landfill, to production of new materials, and to the final construction, are all contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. It's not just the operational emissions that need to be factored in. It doesn't really matter how many stars a new building has. It will take many years for the emissions generated from the entire construction process to be offset. And this is assuming that the operational emissions will be lower than what is currently there, which may not be the case. Secondly, targets have also been set by Council to reduce landfill through waste minimisation policies. But again, this will be very difficult to achieve if destruction of our built heritage continues at the current rate. We are constantly being reminded to avoid, reduce, reuse, recycle when it comes to our household waste, with avoidance being seen as the best choice. Why isn't this being applied to construction? Why aren't we putting avoidance at the top of the agenda? Climate change, landfill and planning's policies need to be talking in a much more meaningful way. Otherwise, it will be very difficult to reach Council's targets. How can Boroondara talk about the need to reduce our environmental footprint, yet still allow these sorts of developments to proceed when their footprint is so much larger than what is currently there? I can't really see how this development can be justified on any level. It is contrary to Council's climate change and landfill policies. There are already 9 apartments on site, plus off-street parking. Isn't this enough? It contributes to our sense of place. It has an historical association with prominent local builder Eric Humphreys, father of Barry Humphreys. It has a large established garden with trees that are much greater net absorbers of carbon dioxide than the young plantings which will occur in the new development. And it is much more sympathetic to the streetscape, including the adjacent and significant Hatfield apartments built at a similar time than what is being proposed. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Cooper. Are there any questions, councillors, for Ms. Cooper? Councillor Watson.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation, Ms. Cooper. I'm just wanting you to perhaps connect some dots for me so that I can be very clear about what you're asking and what you're suggesting Boroondara Council should do tonight.
To reject the application.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So you mentioned that demolitions result in higher carbon emissions and
the whole process, yeah.
Yeah, and greater contributions to landfill. So are you wanting us to apply that principle to this particular building? But are you also wanting, is this an expression of your belief that we should actually do this for every property that comes to us for a demolition permit, or does this only relate to heritage?
This, I'm making a general statement, but it also applies to this particular property tonight. I think that greater justification of demolition of existing building stock needs to be made, and that should include more of the climate change effects and landfill effects. It's death by 1,000 cuts, and you can't keep accumulating these cuts without having an impact. So, yeah.
All right, so just a follow-up question, if I may. So I guess what I'd like to be clear on is you're essentially making a policy statement about all demolition or heritage demolition. Are you specifically wanting...
I think that this is it's something that needs to be factored into any consideration of a demolition proposal, yes. But this is just... In this case, it's an added cog in the wheel. There's all these other factors, historical association, sense of place, but this is another factor that should be put into every application to demolish, yes.
Okay, thank you very much for your clarification.
Okay, sorry if it wasn't clear. Yep.
Thank you, Ms Cooper. If there are no further questions, you may return to your seat. Thank you very much. I call upon next Ms Anna Karina to come to the horseshoe table, followed by Ms Jane Oldham. You have 3 minutes. Please commence with your name and suburb.
Anna Karina, Canterbury.
Thank you.
My family have lived in Camberwell for 5 generations and have a strong connection to the area. I'm a member of both the Camberwell Historical Society and the Art Deco and Modernism Society. Rotherwood is an important piece of our local history in Camberwell. This Art Deco building was built in 1939 by Eric Humphreys, father of national treasure, international icon Barry Humphreys, aka Dame Edna. Rotherwood was named after Humphreys' great-uncle's home in Bromborough, England. Next door to the east of historic 84-year-old Rotherwood are the heritage-listed Hatfield Flats Heritage Overlay 723. The heritage-listed Rivoli Cinema, Heritage Overlay 482 to the west at the junction, was built 1 year after Rotherwood in 1940 and appears to have used the same bricks. Riversdale Road is not a commercial corridor. Natika Schmieder said that the flats at 570 Riversdale Road were externally inspected twice, both before and during the Camberwell Heritage Gap study. Both times she concluded that the buildings could be contributory to a precinct. A second opinion was sought from other heritage consultants with the same conclusion. That's the end of that. Council could consider a modern Art Deco style flat precinct or streetscape, which includes 570 and 576 Riversdale as contributory parts, or consider including Rotherwood in the Prospect Hill Road precinct, Heritage Overlay 159 opposite, or southeast in the St John's Wood and Sages Paddock precinct, Heritage Overlay 739. In stark contrast to both historic Art Deco Rotherwood and Hatfield with their consistent, mature treed front garden settings, matching low brick walls and street setback, the developer's modern and out-of-keeping proposal presents to the street as an oversized, bland amenities block, lacking character with no respect for heritage Hatfield adjoining to the east or the streetscape. The proposal is undeserving of using the name Rotherwood. If the developer were to keep and preserve Rotherwood's original existing historic building, including the front garden setting and low brick wall, there is land at the rear which could be sympathetically developed, respecting the neighbours to the east at heritage-listed Hatfield and to the south in Butler Street. I oppose the application as it stands until the developer actually respects Eric Humphreys' legacy in a true and meaningful way, as per the family's request. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Karina. Are there any questions for Ms Karina by councillors? Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Chair. Just a curiosity question. Was Eric Humphreys an architect of note?
Yes, he was. He built several houses in the Golf Links Estate, Heritage Overlay 1.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. There'll be no further question. You can please return to your gallery. Thank you for your presentation.
Would you like me to read the other one now or not? This is on behalf of one of the residents who couldn't be here tonight.
So you have a written statement for her? It's not a continuation of your own statement, is it?
No, it's just a very little one.
Okay, you can read that. I would say that this is a statement that Ms. Karina would read on behalf of API Las Pajis, and please proceed.
Okay. Dear Council, we have resided at Butler Street, Camberwell since 1964. Since then, we have sadly witnessed the loss of some beautiful homes in the area. We are opposed to this planning application if it requires demolition of the existing building located at 750 Riversdale Road, Camberwell. Rotherwood contributes to our cultural heritage, the historic neighbourhood character, which is quickly disappearing. It provides affordable housing and should be heritage protected. Its demolition would not meet community expectations of more environmentally sustainable housing strategies. And yours faithfully, Mrs. Anastasia Barbadonis, Michael Barbadonis, Peter Barbadonis, and Ms. Appy Les Pagis?
Las Pajis, that's okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for that. I'm not inclined to allow any questions because you are reading a statement on somebody's behalf. Thank you very much. You can return to the gallery. Ms. Jane Oldham, please, I call upon. Followed by Mr. Matthew Cadillo. Please commence with your name and suburb.
Jane Oldham, Camberwell.
You have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Good evening, councillors and officers. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute tonight. The application before you ticks boxes sufficiently in the planning scheme for officers to support the proposal. But if approved, we need to ask ourselves what message we are really sending to developers, to future generations, and those of lower economic means. Those messages are such that this proposal ought not to be approved. We would be telling developers that it's not difficult to buy a site, to move on the existing tenants, bulldoze what exists, send it to landfill and replace with luxury apartments. The planning scheme as it stands, be that the one that council itself has developed or be that influenced by state policy, does not make it difficult to do just that. There are no strenuous requirements as to environmental sustainability. We just have to look at page 164. All the arborist had to say to support the proposal was, as the location of the crossover complies with the setbacks required under the guidelines for trees, the proposal can be supported. There'll be standard planning permit conditions included. What does that actually achieve in terms of environmental sustainability and open space? The large pin oak will be retained. There will be some minimal vegetation planted around the sides and to the rear. There'll be a little open space at the front. But truly, is that about environmental sustainability and providing adequate open space in our community? We need to consider, as Ms. Cooper did earlier, the environmental impacts of the demolition. The response in your report is that the planning requirements do not require us, or you, sorry, to do so. The loss of affordable housing, again, not a planning consideration. You're told that we cannot predict how the market price of these new units, nor the wealth of those who will live in them. However, we know in our heart of hearts that that's really not the case. If this development is allowed to proceed, it demonstrates the opportunity that you, councillors and council officers, have to influence the future of planning considerations going forward. We need to provide both affordable housing and we need to address, as a matter of urgency, the impacts of demolition and the landfill that they create.
Thank you, Ms. Oldham. Your time has expired. Councillors, are there any questions for Ms. Oldham? There be no questions. Thank you for your submission. Please return to the seat in the gallery. Thank you very much. Now I call upon Mr. Matthew Cardigo, followed by Mrs. Mary Drost. Mr. Cardigo, please state your name and suburb.
Matthew Cardillo, I'm in Camberwell.
Sorry, apologies for that.
That's okay.
Yep, you have 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. Good evening, councils and council officers. Thank you for the opportunity to make the submission this evening in regards to the planning permit at 570 Riversdale Road. I'm here this evening on behalf of some of the owners of the adjoining property at 576 Riversdale Road, known as Hadfield. Per my objection letter submitted last year, I acknowledge that despite the loss of affordable housing and an older style 1930s building, there are some benefits to redeveloping 570 Riversdale Road in a manner that is sympathetic. I appreciate also the work that's been undertaken by Council and the UPDC document to address the residents' concerns and provide detail on the considerations applied to arrive at this position. Notwithstanding this, there are 4 points that I'd like to raise for your consideration this evening. The first being the basement car park, and whilst I understand that the planning permit stage does not consider engineering and structural elements, our request is that thorough assessment of the engineering elements, groundwater, drainage assessment and structural design be undertaken as part of the building permit process. We raise this to ensure that the development has no adverse structural impacts on the significantly graded Hatfield property next door. Building upon this point, should the proposed development obtain both planning and building permit approval, we'd like to request that regular monitoring and a dilapidation report be undertaken prior to and after construction to ensure, to my prior point, that no adverse impacts are made on the significantly graded Hatfield property. Thirdly, despite the council assessing resident parking on the basis that the minimum statutory parking requirements are met, of which obviously 40 spots does meet this test, it stated that it can't prescribe a maximum unless it is ridiculously large. We do feel that the planned number of parking spots is, however, excessive. It is our view that any new development should be encouraging a reduction in car usage from a sustainability perspective, especially in an area that is so well serviced by public transport with close proximity to the Camberwell shopping precinct. And finally, we'd like to comment on the building height. Whilst the building itself does fall within the 12-metre limit, there is plant screening that exceeds the 12-metre limit. We acknowledge the simple definition in the planning scheme as applied by the council, which states that the height is to be taken to the top of the building, excluding plant and associated items on top of it. And we're also aware of the VCAT decision in Aitken Properties and Hobsons Bay Council, which outlines a similar view, except in the instance of a lift overrun of such a size or type of construction that it should be treated as a roofed element in its own right. In this case, the roofed element does appear to come under the maximum allowance. However, at approximately a third of the length of the building, the plant screening is significant and exceeds the height limit on the western elevation. We are surprised that such significant screening is not considered part of the building height. To close, we are not opposed in principle to the redevelopment of the property, but in raising objections and speaking here today, we wish to ensure that the proposed development positively contributes to our neighbourhood and that all engineering and structural elements are properly considered to ensure no adverse impacts on the much loved and significant
Mr. Cardillo, your time has expired.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. Cardillo? Councillor Wigger.
Yes, thank you so much. I'm interested in your comments about the maximum car parking spaces. Just out of interest, do you know how many parking spaces there are at Hatfield?
Yes, we have parking for 12 apartments, so it's essentially one car spot per apartment.
12 spots per apartment, yeah. And presumably it's about the same at Rotherwood.
Yeah, I believe currently it's a similar provision. That's correct, at Rotherwood. Yes.
And did you have a thought about what, in your mind, is a more appropriate?
Well, I mean, in my opinion, I think you could, there's scope to reduce it from a double-storey basement to a single-storey and just apply the minimum statutory requirement. As I said, we're so lucky to be in an area so well serviced by public transport, it just seems unnecessary.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Wigger. Councillor Franco.
Thank you, Mr. Cardillo. I also have two questions. One following on from the same issue that Councillor Bigger raised. Could you advise, say at Hatfield, do residents with a single car space, are they also entitled to parking permits, or do they operate with the single car space?
My understanding is that yes, we are able to apply for a parking permit to park on Riversdale Road, but there's only one side of Riversdale Road that requires a parking permit. The other side is timed. Is timed parking, I believe.
Thank you. And the other issue, you were speaking towards the end, and I was struggling. I think you mentioned screening that you were surprised about. Could you just expand on that, because I was trying to catch it, but I didn't catch it.
So what's the question, Councillor Franco?
The screening issue.
Sure. Can you repeat that, Mr. Kadira?
Sure. So I guess just the overall the bulk of the screening. So it is a third. It appears to be from the plans roughly a third of the length of the building, and understand the interpretation of the planning scheme. But we feel it's a necessary consideration, given on the western elevation it does appear to exceed the 12-metre height limit, given the size of the plant screening.
Thank you, Councillor Franco. There have been no further questions. You may return to your seat. And thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
I call upon Ms. Mary Drost, followed by Mrs. Christina Brannigan. I think you know the sequence, Mrs. Drost. Your name and suburb.
Yes. So good evening, everybody. So I'm Mary Drost, and I live in Prospect Hill Road, Camberwell, not far away from where this development's being talked about. And I went and had a look earlier today, and to see what I thought. And I thought, oh no, they mustn't allow this. You know, this block of flats there. What are they going to do? Pull down those and put up huge amount of that back and fill it all up? You know, we've got enough development there. And I think it's, you know, the area where I live, of course, is heritage. And I was on council years ago when we made it heritage. And it's hardly changed in that time in the Prospect Hill Road area. But other areas have changed. And I think it's time we protected Camberwell from overdevelopment. And I think this would be an overdevelopment, okay? And I think that we don't need that in Camberwell. Let them go out further and destroy somewhere else. But that's, you know, it's a heritage area, Camberwell. The whole of Camberwell should be heritage. And I'm not quite sure how far the heritage area extends, but I know I was on where you sat. I was on council when we brought that in, making it heritage. And I think that we've got to protect it from all these dreadful developments. So please, throw this out and say no. Go home.
Thank you, Ms. Drost. Are there any questions for Mrs. Drost? Thank you. Thank you for your presentation, Ms. Drost. Ms. Christina Brannigan, thank you. Please commence with your name and suburb, and you have 3 minutes.
Thank you. Can I just ask for my PowerPoint slide to go up? My name is Christina Brannigan. I live in Camberwell. Good evening, councillors and officers. I'm speaking to ask very respectfully of the developers purchasing Rotherwood and of the council that you find a better solution, please, for the future Camberwell community. This proposal to approve demolition of this really immense, solidly built building of 9 desirable, intact Art Deco flats that were built by a significant local builder makes little sense to many of us. Its placing into landfill for only 5 or so additional homes and at luxury prices seems to be a poor outcome from 3 angles: housing affordability, the environment, and heritage neighbourhood character. We all know there aren't enough moderately priced homes in Camberwell anymore. Ordinary people are being priced out. Council has a policy to encourage diversity in homes, wants more sustainable development and a city working for better climate outcomes, but approving this development seems to go against all 3 of those aims. And in fact, recent research by Prosper Australia proves shockingly that around 10% of homes in Burundara are actually vacant. which means investors are here, as we know, and are driving up prices. We also know that Boroondara has lost much tree and green canopy through development. In actual fact, I think we need flats like Rotherwood more now than ever before. These flats need a really only renovation of their kitchens and bathrooms, it would seem, and then they would be highly desirable small homes and very likely snapped up by renters and buyers. These sorts of 1930s Art Deco flats sell really easily all over Melbourne, as those of us who lived in other parts of Melbourne know. Their demolition seems to make no sense and have poor environmental outcome. And councillors, if some of you have been up close to this building, you'll know that the flats are a huge intact brick building made from thousands and thousands of bricks, which quite probably came from the old Fritz Salter brickworks down the road, which we've talked about a lot here in this room. They have stylish and beautiful exterior staircases. On the entrance, they've got many decorative features and are made from natural materials, which is what people were using in the 1930s. Is all of this really to be thrown into landfill? For what benefit? This building would still be there in 100 years' time because of the way it's been built, and people would still want to live there. I don't understand why we're accepting as a community and council that it might be okay to chuck this building in the bin as if it's some disposable 21st century rubbish. It's not okay, and I think we in the community must call it out. People locally understand that developers wish to maximise profits, but we think that this can be achieved with more creativity in the approach. There seems to be plenty of room to build extra small homes attached to the rear of the original flats and to retain them. In fact, perhaps you could even build more than 15 homes if you did it in this way. There's a lot of land at the back of the house, at least 2 tennis court size blocks. And from a heritage perspective, the Art Deco Society, the Camberwell Historical Society and many community members have asked council to place the flats in the heritage overlay. We've heard tonight what the officers have said, but...
Thank you, Ms Brannigan. Your time has expired.
Okay, thanks for listening.
Are there any questions for Ms Brannigan? There have been no questions. Thank you for your presentation. You can return to your seat in the gallery. Thank you very much. I call upon Mrs Nerida Muirden, followed by Liz Burton. Ms Muirden, please. Thank you, Ms Muirden. Please commence with your name and suburb.
Hi, I'm Nerida Muirden. I'm living in Camberwell. Hello, councillors. Thanks for the opportunity to speak tonight. I am actually reading out Greg Deacon's presentation. Greg does not support the officer's recommendation. Greg says, before council sanctions the demolition of Rotherwood at 570 Riversdale Road, Camberwell, it should be satisfied that the building does not merit inclusion in a putative new heritage precinct provisionally titled Camberwell Junction Interwar Flats Precinct. Rotherwood is adjacent to the heritage significant Hatfield Flats, HO 723 at 576 Riversdale Road, and directly opposite the Oaks Flats at 573 Riversdale Road. Taken together, these 3 block of flats, built in the period 1935 to 1942, represent a new approach to the residential construction in Camberwell, in that they are larger and bolder than other smaller and more modest flats. The statement of significance for Hatfield Flats cites the slow penetration of flats into Camberwell during the interwar period, mainly along the main thoroughfares such as Riversdale Road. These observations apply equally to Rotherwood and the Oaks and go to criterion A, being historical significance. The 3 flats in question are built in different architectural styles, Rotherwood in the Georgian Revival style with Art Deco influences, the Oaks in an austere variant of the modern style, Hatfield in an eclectic mixture of the modern and Georgian Revival styles. In this case, it is the different approaches to design in response to the same social needs that is of interest, which go to criterion D, being representativeness. The 3 flats in question share a common aesthetic approach in that they are all well set back from the street behind low front fences in garden settings with mature trees in a way that offsets the bulks of the buildings and complements the broader residential garden aesthetic of Camberwell. This supports criterion E, being aesthetic significance. Not a lot of interwall flats were built in Camberwell, and very few of the size and scale under consideration here. 2 of the 3 flats in question are under development pressures, and in this respect, I believe criterion B, being rarity, is a consideration. Taken together, the 3 blocks of flats encompass 27 dwellings. By way of comparison, the Havelock Road Linton Court precinct of flats is comprised of 8 blocks of flats and 28 dwellings and has a very different character. The validity of a Camberwell Junction interwall flats precinct was not assessed as part of the Heritage Gap study. Although Rotherwood was deemed to be not significant in its own right, it was assessed as able to contribute to a heritage precinct should one exist. I submit that the Council engages an appropriately experienced heritage advisor to assess the validity of a heritage flats precinct as a matter of urgency. And finally, the Camberwell Heritage Gap Assessment noted there is a significant pin oak tree in the front garden which should be recognised. This tree should be placed on the Burundara Significant Tree Register. Thank you, that's it.
Thank you for reading Mr. Deacon's statement, Ms. Muirden. You can return to the seat.
Thank you.
Thank you. I call upon Ms. Liz Burton, followed by... Oh, not followed by anybody. Thank you very much. Please state your name and suburb.
Thank you, and good evening, councillors and officers. I'm here to speak against the recommendation, and I'm wanting to draw attention to the fact that the current block of flats at 570 Riversdale Road already complies with the objectives of the planning scheme, but it does more than this. It delivers a high-quality brick structure of 3 storeys in excellent condition, structurally sound and in the art modern design. The condition of the building suggests it has potential to offer quality accommodation for decades, if not hundreds of years into the future. Furthermore, it formerly had a tennis court located at the rear, providing residents with on-site sporting facilities, which could be reinstated in a reconceptualised vision for the property. The buildings of this kind are highly sought by tenants and owners in suburbs such as...
Chair, could I just raise a point of order? On many of the submissions, and this one thus far, are just utterly irrelevant to the matter before us. I mean, we've got an application for a development.
Yes.
And the submissions need to actually address the matter before us. I mean, there's been a real divergence between what's before us and what we're hearing submissions on tonight. I'm not sure why that is, but I mean, submitters need to perhaps be reminded that the matter before us is an application for a development, and that seems to be being lost in this, and we're spending a very great deal of time listening to submissions that are utterly irrelevant to the application before us. And that's all we can decide, of course.
Thank you, Councillor Park. I'm inclined to allow Ms. Burton to continue because some of the presentations did have a combination of those factors that you mentioned. Some of them did pertain to some planning matters, but I agree the overwhelming majority, they were interspersed with many comments and views that were not relevant to the application at hand. And I'm giving the speakers the benefit of the doubt, but thank you for your point of order.
Could I just ask Councillor Park what he thinks is irrelevant about my submission?
No. Could you continue with your presentation, and there will be an opportunity to... No, quiet please. We won't cheer yet. Could you please continue with your presentation? Yes. Councillor Park has a valid point, but continue with your presentation.
Yes, certainly.
Because I'm giving you latitude to conclude. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, if I could have the next slide. I just wanted to draw attention to common elements between the Rivoli, which has a significant classification, and the Rotherwood building.
If you can please go to the slide before the Rivoli, thank you. So the Rivoli Cinema is listed on the Victorian Heritage Database as having state significance, and the citation includes the following: is significant for its association with Robert McLeish, a prominent figure in the film industry in Victoria from the 1910s to the 1940s. The Rivoli was the flagship of his chain. Similarly, Rotherwood has a very close association, as has been pointed out, with Barry Humphries, who is an internationally renowned satirist and really a legendary icon.
May I interject right now? And I'll ask Mr. Walker to explain to you at this particular point why this may not be relevant to the application at hand, because you asked the question of Councillor Park.
Thanks, Chair. Happy just to clarify that what is before you this evening, before the Council this evening, is an application for planning permit. And you need to consider that application having regard to the relevant planning considerations, and they're outlined for you within the report that you have this evening. And we'll touch on some of those points in the response to the submitters in a moment. What isn't before you this evening is a consideration of whether this property has heritage merit or not. That has been tested separately, and there is no heritage overlay over this property. So you're not testing that or considering that this evening. You're considering the application on the current planning controls. There is no heritage overlay over the property. So that's what you just need to understand, what it is that you're considering this evening in terms of the application, and it is not whether this property has heritage merit or not in terms of a future or consideration of a potential overlay.
I was simply wanting also then to move on to draw attention to the rarity of that building that we're discussing at 570 Riversdale Road. We are informed in the City of Boroondara Municipal-wide Heritage Gap Study Volume 2 relating to Camberwell, during the 1920s, relatively few blocks of flats would be built in the present-day City of Boroondara, and virtually all of these were situated in the former City of Hawthorn. In Camberwell, the distance from the city meant a slower development of flats. By the end of the 1920s, they appeared in several of the neighbouring suburbs, yet it was still a rarity in Camberwell. The Depression of the 1930s resulted in
Ms. Burton, your time has expired. Thank you very much. Are there any questions, councillors? There be no questions. Please return to your seat in the gallery. Thank you very much for your presentation. Now, I said there are no more presenters. There is one more against, Juan Luo, but he will not be speaking. I do have one presenter, Mr. Terribly sorry, Councillor Thompson.
Sorry, Chair. You might have were alluding to the fact that, is there a presenter for the applicant?
I was going to go to that. Thank you very much. There is now one more presenter on the fore side, Mr. Damien Lockman. Please proceed to the horseshoe table. Mr. Lockman, state your name and who you're representing.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Damien Locknan, G2 Urban Planning. We're a planning consultancy representing the permit applicant.
Thank you. You have 3 minutes. Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Firstly, I'd just like to say that...
I'm the planning chair, not the mayor. The mayor sits over there.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman. Firstly, I'd just like to say my client has developed in Boroondara before at a site at 18 St George's Crescent, Ashburton. In terms of this particular proposal, my office on behalf of my client undertook a due diligence assessment, contacted Council's Strategic Planning Department, questioning as to whether there was any heritage implications on the site, and we were advised that there was no heritage implication, and it was on that basis that my client purchased the site If there was an understanding of heritage or potential heritage implication, then my client would have most likely not purchased the site. So that was on the basis of that advice. Some residents have mentioned that the retention of the building would be an admirable thing to have happen. What I would say to that is that it is a difficult proposition. It is readily achievable in dwellings, single dwellings, where, for instance, an addition could be added, a first floor addition or addition at the rear, knock down a wall, extend a kitchen and the like. This is not a single dwelling. It's a 3-storey apartment or building that was built approximately 90 or so years ago. It has issues that would be of concern in terms of today's construction standards regarding ESD, performance within the building, fire safety, also in terms of the internal livability. The kitchens, I have to say, by today's substandard, whilst we can wax lyrical about some elements of the building, are substandard. The kitchens are substandard. There would be a major redo of that building. The driveway down the west side is 2.5 metres wide to the title boundary. That just would not be accepted today. These are just scratching on the surface some of the issues that would render difficulty in retaining the building. It's just simply not feasible from my client's perspective. Now, in terms of the building itself, we note that there were no submissions made against the design, the layout, off-site amenity and the like. And we believe that, we say unashamedly that the building is a most positive response. References made earlier to tree retention. Well, we do retain the pin oak at the front. We also provide an additional planting regime that is substantially better than what there is now, so it is a much better response to the site. Overall, we commend the officer's report. We say that it is overwhelmingly in support of our proposal, that has been well considered. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Loughnane.
Chair.
We're going to questions now from councillors. Councillor Thompson.
Thank you for your presentation. Couple of questions. Just very specifically, do you accept the officer's recommendation inclusive of all conditions?
Yes, we do. Yes.
Thank you. You're a stat planner. You're obviously a planning background, those sorts of things.
That's correct.
Do you notice any changes with regards to the planning system forthcoming with regards to sustainability, embodied energy and those sorts of things? Do you see that impacting on the planning system?
Well, I certainly note that I think it might be August or later this year that there will be a new set of more stringent controls. Look, all I can say to that is that we are subject to the controls of the day. I've been involved in many proposals that get an approval, and then down the track there may be an amendment or some change, and then they have to go through a more rigorous process. So this is the nature of ESD at the moment, so we understand that.
And one further question. Has your client at all reviewed the existing facility and an extension to that, retaining the existing and extending off it, or is it never really considered?
Look, it was certainly considered as a possibility early in the process, but look, I have to say that it didn't really get to any great degree of consideration just because of the inherent difficulties in retaining the building, providing access to the rear. The basement parking would have to be at the rear rather than being at the front. It's a completely different proposal. That is in terms of the logistical, functional elements. There is also a question of marketability, and look, it's not unreasonable to expect that a marketable product should be constructed on this site. Having a building that is dated and of a completely different type at the front, and then having a modern building that is hidden at the rear, how that would work would offer some challenges, I would say.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson. Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your presentation. This is just a curiosity question because we heard in a number of presentations this evening from residents concerns about the amount of material that was going to end up in landfill from demolition. Again, you at liberty not to answer the question, but I just want, it was out of curiosity, do you try and recycle as many materials as you can in developments of this nature?
Our position on that would be in the ESD report of the Sustainability Management Plan, which isn't before me, and you'll appreciate there's a realm of information and sometimes it's difficult to be on top of everything. It is a normal statement or a normal course of events that part of that report does have recycling and reuse of materials. I would expect that would be in there. Yeah.
That's good to hear. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. Councillor Gillies.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr Laumann, for your presentation. My first two questions have actually, you've already addressed them. Thank you for that. One further question leading on from both Councillor Watson's and Councillor Thompson's regarding the carbon emissions question overlays with the question regarding reuse of materials, but would your client be willing to undertake a discussion with officers regarding the retention with respect to minimising the greenhouse gases which are likely to be inherent with demolition?
I would say that my client has probably got some concern, and as a town planner, I would as well. The suitable avenue would be through the Sustainable Management Plan, through the ESD process that is implemented by Boroondara Council and all councils across the state, basically. And that, by what it purports to achieve, seeks to address these sorts of very issues. To put an additional layer where there may be some uncertainty, I think may well be unworkable as a permit condition, because it would need to be clear in the Sustainable Management Plan process, and I'm not sure that would be. I know that as referred to earlier, that the controls, the environmental requirements are becoming more stringent. So if I can suggest that there is greater attention to these issues, then that may allay some concern.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Gillies, you had an answer to your question? Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Mr Lachlan, thank you for your presentation. In light of what you've heard this evening from the community and their obviously strong reservations and concerns about the demolition of the property, you mentioned markability of what is existing. I just wanted to ask if you'd considered, or if your client has considered, having the history of a celebrity figure who was the designer of the building and the connection obviously to Barry Humphries and his family, but also the social significance, the structural integrity, the design as it is at the moment. If it was retained, to do a rather elaborate extension at the rear connecting to the property, it may be not perhaps your thought first process, but in light of what you've heard this evening, do you think your client would consider that?
No, I would say no, to that. And again, I go back to my council's and my client's initial contact and the contact from my firm, and that was that there was no heritage significance. Certainly, the previous owner didn't see fit to put any sort of control or provide any type of restriction when that previous owner could have done that, whereas it was sold to my client without any such control. I know that there had been 2 heritage reviews from the council, 2 separate reviews that have both not deemed fit to see it as having heritage significance. And I think given that position, then that's the lie of the land.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hollingsworth. Councillor Addis.
Thanks very much, Chair. Mr Lachlan, thank you. You mentioned, I think, the driveway 2.5 metres. Did I hear that correctly?
It might be 2.5 something, but it is about 2.5 from the chimney on the west wall to the title boundary. Yeah.
And what would currently be the standard?
3 metres. It's a standard requirement for a 3 metre driveway. Now, of course, there'd be a curb to either side as well, which would take up more than 3 metres. Might be 3.1, 3.15, 3.2 metres. Yeah, so that would be, certainly for the vehicle access, 3 metres wide is the standard. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Adders. There being no further questions, thank you. Mr Lachlan, you can return to your seat. Ms Britt-Gerber, are there any matters arising from the presentations?
Through you, Mr Chair. Thank you to all those who have raised a number of matters tonight. I would like to collectively address the concerns as follows. In terms of heritage, we've heard that the subject site is not in a heritage overlay. It was thoroughly assessed by 2 heritage consultants and reached the same conclusion, which was also tested within the independent panel. The Camberwell Heritage Gap Study in August 2018 found the property did not reach the threshold for individual heritage significance, and no heritage precinct was identified in this area. A heritage overlay does not apply to the subject site, therefore the heritage policy is not applicable, and apart from a heritage overlay, there is nothing in the planning scheme preventing the demolition of the existing building. With regard to the Hatfield Flats next door, Council has assessed the impact on the Hatfield Flats against neighbourhood character, noting the development adjacent to a property in an individual heritage overlay should provide a transition in scale. It is considered that the 2- and 3-storey components of the proposed building, together with adequate side and front setbacks, provide a suitable transition to the Hatfield Flats sites, and the neighbourhood character objectives have been achieved. In terms of sustainability, apart from a heritage overlay, there is nothing in the planning scheme preventing the demolition of the existing building or requiring reuse of the bricks. Whilst Council does not have an ESD policy, a sustainable management plan submitted with the application addresses the proposed development sustainability credentials and performance targets against the Built Environment Sustainability Scorecard, known as BESS. These guidelines, which are the only dedicated tool in Victoria for assessing sustainable design at the planning permit stage. The development has a score of 59%, which is higher than the required score of 50% for best practice in accordance with the BESS tool. The development has also been assessed by Council's ESD officer, who is fully supportive of the proposal. In terms of the plant screening, it is not considered this is part as the calculation of the building height as defined in the planning scheme, and it is not uncommon for design responses for these plant screenings to be placed on roofs of buildings. In terms of affordable housing, the planning permit assessment does not allow for consideration of future purchase prices or occupants of new dwellings. Speculation about future residents is impossible to gauge and is no assistance to the determination of this planning application and is determined by market values at the time. To clarify the matter brought up about the trees, the street trees and the pin oak were assessed by Council's Environment, Sustainability and Open Space Department and Council's arborists, who considered all tree removal and planting opportunities on the site and was satisfied with the design response, including the retention of the pin oak tree in the front setback. With regard to the construction impacts of the new build, the basement plans indicate the setbacks to the property boundaries, showing the size of the basement. Structural information is not required as part of the planning permit assessment and will be assessed at the building permit stage. The building surveyor will require the method of construction and proposed protection works be provided to the adjoining owners. Protection works notices are then served on the adjoining property owners, including any relevant reports required as part of the building planning process. In terms of excessive car parking, the scheme meets the car parking requirements of the planning scheme, and it's not uncommon for apartment developments to have multi-level basements to accommodating the parking requirements in accordance with the planning scheme. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Splitgerber. Councillors, are there any questions of officers? Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Chair. I was just wondering whether the officers could explain a little bit more about this 59% score, if that would be okay.
Thank you. The 59% score refers to the BEST tool, which requires a minimum 50% score, and it encompasses a range of ESD requirements for new builds. This includes stormwater management, waste management, and energy efficiency, for instance. So the development needs to meet certain criteria to achieve that minimum 50% score.
Thank you very much.
Ms Splitgerber, is the name of the tool BEST, or is that the best tool?
That is the name of the tool.
Thank you for the clarification. Next, we have Councillor Gillies.
Thank you, Chair. Also to foreshadow a motion, but a question. Thank you, Ms Splitgerber. Now, I note that the application's been assessed as acceptable to ESD standards, but if you could help me with that, please. Does that assessment identify any sort of estimate of the carbon emissions that would be generated by demolition?
Thank you for your question. The BEST tool does not require carbon emissions to be calculated as part of that score.
Okay, thank you. You've answered my question.
Any other question, Councillor Gillies?
No, but I mentioned that I'll foreshadow a motion.
That's duly noted. Councillor Thompson.
Thanks, Mr Chair. Couple of questions. Just a point of clarification the officers might be able to assist me with. Mr Eric Humphreys, was he an architect, a builder or a developer, or a collection of all the two? Because I've never seen him referenced as an architect previously.
Mr Walker?
Just to clarify that through yourself, Chair, don't have the full details in relation to his background. My understanding, he wasn't an architect, he was a developer. However, that's something I don't have up-to-date detailed information about.
That's okay. Don't know if you may not be able to answer this, Mr Walker, this question, but if council was resolved tonight not to make a decision on this, would you anticipate from the applicant's position that they may go to VCAT?
Yeah, through you, yes.
Through yourself, Chair, and perhaps I answer that question a little bit differently. That's a speculation as to whether the applicants would go direct to VCAT or not. However, I would make the point that given the Christmas New Year period and the inability of the UPDC to sit over that period, the application has now gone beyond the 60 statutory day period in which a decision should be made on the application. That means that at any point in time now and from tomorrow, if a decision is not made this evening, the applicant would be able to go direct to VCAT and appeal the failure of the council not to make a decision within the statutory time frame.
Yep. Another question. Irrespective of the planning application on hand, can the applicant put in a Section 29A demolition application, and where would councils arrive with that application?
Thanks again through yourself, Chair. There is no planning tool or consideration of demolition in relation to this site. So that means if a Section 29A application was submitted to council, we would need to form a view as to whether there's any heritage basis to refuse that application and seek a heritage overlay over the property. You've been given information this evening that the heritage matter has been tested on a couple of occasions, and there is no heritage basis to prevent or stop a Section 29A approval or consent, which means that then a demolition permit would be automatic.
Okay, and that can be within 4 weeks? I guess that's at the... So from the time that an application is provided, Mr Walker, what time do we have to assess that demolition application?
Through yourself, Chair, we would have 15 days in which to consider that. However, if I just make a further point, I've just been informed that a Section 29A approval was granted late last year, which means that a demolition permit could be issued under that consent at any time at this point in time.
So the demolition application's been made and yet we have not resolved a position on that as yet?
So just to clarify, yes, we have, because there is no heritage basis for refusing that Section 29A.
So we've granted a permit?
No, that's not what... Actually, just to clarify the process. The process is that a building permit for demolition can be obtained from any private building surveyor. The private building surveyor must first obtain consent under Section 29A from the council before they issue that permit. That Section 29A consent has been granted, as I understand. However, we haven't received information that a building permit for demolition has been issued. So whilst the consent has been issued and given, it's not automatic that that transfers to a building permit. That's something that would have to be obtained from a private building surveyor.
Final question, Chair. Thank you for your indulgence. Obviously, with the Section 29A consents being given, it's very unusual for council to withdraw consent.
Again, through yourself, Chair, I don't believe council can withdraw its consent.
Thank you. No further questions.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson. We have Councillor Gold next.
Thank you, Chair. Just referring back to one of the comments made by the last presenter tonight, I think he said there was some ESD changes coming down the line. I presume he's referring to CASB's attempt to having state rules or the 24 councils applying for changes to ESD regulations. And I think he said at that time that if those were brought in, you would then be able to further amend the permit to take into consideration those ESD requirements. Is that the case? I'm a bit surprised.
Again, through yourself, Chair, there's probably a couple of things going on in the ESD space, and maybe I'll just explain those a little bit. Because they do come together and different scenarios will apply depending on what it is that has changed. The state government has a program for introducing and considering additional ESD requirements, and there is a process for them doing that, starting with the high-end state policies within the planning scheme, which have been introduced. That was a stage one. The second stage is to consider new planning rules for the planning scheme. That's stage two, which is underway for consideration at the moment. And separately, Burundara, along with 23 other councils, so there's 24 councils, are pursuing local planning policy requirements that might go ahead of or be instead of any state changes that take place. So those two things are underway in terms of changing the planning rules. I don't believe that a change to those planning rules, if they come in at a future point in time, will be able to be applied retrospectively to existing permits. So that's where I would agree with the comments that you've made in regard to that. However, there is a third consideration, which is changes to the Building Code of Australia that is being considered nationally, and that those changes are being now considered and put forward as recommended changes that help improve ESD outcomes for developments using the building system to complement the future changes to the planning system. Those changes, if they come in later in the year, which they potentially will, and each state is now considering those recommended changes and whether they will come in and apply, I believe would apply to new developments that have a building permit issued at that point in time. And usually a building permit is not issued until a development is close to commencing. So if those building permit changes come in, they will apply to the development irrespective of the planning permit that's been issued now. I hope that makes sense in terms of the two systems working together.
If I may extend that question a little further through you, Mr Chair. You mentioned the best tool available to us at this point in time, and putting aside your comments about some things being brought to bear through the building permit, under the best tool, were we able to apply any requirements to saving materials? You mentioned the bricks can't be saved. Is there any requirement that can be applied at this point in time to save any of the materials, or can they all simply be taken to tip?
Through you, Mr Chair. So the BEST tool has certain mandatory initiatives that they must meet in terms of energy, stormwater, water and indoor environmental quality. It does not, the mandatory requirements don't include the retention or reuse of building materials. So the tool does not require that as a mandatory initiative.
Thank you. If I may, two further quick questions. Under BEST, are there any provisions for passive solar design that we can apply at this stage?
Sorry, through you, Mr Chair. The BEST tool, as explained, only has the 4 mandatory initiatives, and the other initiatives, which include energy consumption and so forth, can be addressed to achieve the minimum score of 50%.
But that is not proposed at this point in time, I presume.
To reuse the materials?
No. If going back to the energy, passive energy, has that been proposed currently in the submission before us?
No.
Thank you. And the final question relates to drainage, but in this case, underground drainage. And in a meeting we had last year from memory, we talked about the potential of, when an excavation is carried out for basements, not only surface drainage is affected, but potentially underground drainage. And as this is downhill of a heritage property, is there potentially some risk that drainage could be trapped by the excavated walls and the basements and affect the uphill site? Thank you.
Through you, Mr Chair. The subject site is not an area recognised in the planning scheme or council's mapping system as an area of flooding. The drainage engineers have assessed the application and are satisfied that the basement construction and the site will be drained to the satisfaction of council, which is included as part of the planning permit as well.
That's surface considerations only, not underground drainage?
There are no means to measure the underground drainage in terms of anything apart from the drainage plans that will be submitted at the building permit process.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gold. Next, we have Councillor Addis.
Thanks very much, Chair. This may be a question for Mr Walker, but we'll see. It relates to our adopted policy as expressed in the Climate Action Plan and our desire to be climate responsible and reduce emissions. So my question is there any statutory power that our Climate Action Plan has that would stand above the planning scheme in terms of the challenges we face in making responsible decisions?
Happy to answer that through yourself, Chair. The Climate Action Plan and its associated strategies and actions do not directly relate to the planning considerations that you are making this evening. However, what it does do is it gives a direction in regard to advocacy and future changes that you want to see to the planning system. So it absolutely is driving the consideration of this council, joining with those 23 other councils to seek changes in regard to ESD in the planning system. In fact, the overall advocacy position of this council is that that the changes should be to the entire planning scheme for all new developments to consider ESD. And your decisions around your climate action approach as a council certainly drives a lot of these other advocacy positions and specific changes that you're seeking in the planning system that you ultimately want to see and will be able to then consider in your planning application considerations. And there was some discussion, for example, around the BESS tool and does that consider all of the different elements of ESD? Well, the BESS tool will be reviewed and considered as part of those future policies and changes to the planning scheme, for example, to improve it and add additional elements to it to get even better outcomes. So certainly your climate action strategy drives a lot of those initiatives and actions and future directions, but is not a direct consideration for the planning application this evening.
So essentially the answer is not yet. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Addis. Councillor Franco, it's your turn.
Thank you, Chair. I have a few questions. Councillor Thompson has asked a number of the ones that I was focusing on, but just to follow on one additional one that's perhaps somewhat related, to what extent, relating to heritage, why didn't we consider an interwar heritage precinct, and to what extent, were council not to support this, would there be scope to consider a precinct, an interwar precinct of 2 blocks of flats? I don't know how small a precinct can be, but taking into consideration flats and 2 properties side by side.
Are you prepared to answer the question?
Yeah, through you, Chair. So the property was considered during the Camberwell Heritage Gap Study in 2018, both from itself as a individually significant property as well as part of a broader precinct. And then that was tested through the independent panel process as well in 2018 and found not to have heritage significance either individually or as part of a precinct. And then we had further community nominations last year and we revisited the property again and specifically considered whether we could form a precinct around that, and the council's heritage advisor formed the view that that was not merited either as a small precinct, which would need to be, I guess, have very strong heritage merit, or extending one of the neighbouring precincts.
Thank you. A couple more questions. Again, following on the questions that other councillors were raising, to what extent, in relation to the ESD principles, I take it that clause 14 of the officer's recommendation, if you go and have a look at that, I think it's for 12, sorry, is that just to be clear, is that where the extent to which we influence or seek to have any involvement in relation to the ESD outcomes and the best model? Is that where it's contained? And I know that you mentioned already the best model doesn't include the reuse of existing materials, but to what extent can council, for example, include in that clause, additional clause of that nature?
Through you, Mr. Chair. That is correct. The condition 12, the Sustainability Management Plan, incorporates the ESD initiatives. And to answer the question, if we can incorporate anything about reuse of the materials, if council were to adopt that, yes, that is a possibility. We can include that as well.
And in relation to that clause, is the responsible authority need not be council, I take it? I just asked that for clarification. That can be a separate certifier?
Through yourself, Chair, no, the responsible authority at the moment, and in this case, would be council. We would be the party responsible for considering the assessment and approval of that plan.
Thank you. Another question. The pin oak that I think Ms. Cooper raised, it's not specifically identified in any of the, I don't think, any of the conditions. And is there merit? I think it was asked why it's not included, other than as a reference to the driveways on the other side. But is there merit of including specific protection of the pin oak itself?
Through you, Mr. Chair. There's no specific reference in the condition 1 of the planning permit to protect the pin oak. However, this is encapsulated in the tree management plan, which will also be required to be endorsed by council, which will require all the protection methods around the construction and retention of that tree.
Thank you. With your indulgence, I only have one more question. Is that okay?
Sure.
In relation to the car parking rates, we've had a bit of discussion. Could you explain why our planning policy emphasises minimum car parking rates rather than maximums, particularly in areas such as Camberwell Junction? And is that, I mean, are we tied to that? Is that a historic thing that we're tied to, particularly in an area where there's so much public transport and is subject to long-term congestion in future and growth?
Through yourself, Chair, the way that the planning schemes are structured around car parking, it sets a framework for minimum car parking expectations and requirements, and that's the way that the planning scheme is set up and the way that it's structured. And the current approach to planning applications applying the car parking test is applying that minimum requirement, but applicants can and sometimes do provide more than that minimum standard. A review of car parking and the way that car parking is approached and the minimum requirements, and whether there could be a reduction in those minimum requirements and a policy direction around having maximum types of car parking expectations or outcomes, could be a consideration as part of the strategic planning work for activity centres like Camberwell. And we've got that work that's underway at the moment, and that is something that could be visited and considered by this council into the future.
Thank you.
Councillor Franco, finished? Thank you. Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to follow on from the question raised by Councillor Thompson before and just seek some clarification from officers, please. Do officers identify any risk in deferring a decision on this matter tonight?
Mr. Walker.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I think the question was around, is there merit in deferring consideration of this application this evening?
If I can just rephrase that to make sure that we're both on the same page. Do officers identify any risk in deferring this matter tonight?
Thanks. Through yourself, Chair. Perhaps those risks have been identified in the responses to some of the questions this evening. The planning application is at a point where it is beyond the 60 statutory days. So I think the primary risk is that the matter is appealed as an out-of-time appeal if the matter is deferred this evening, and it will then proceed to VCAT automatically. And once we're in a VCAT situation, as we know, then there's all sorts of different considerations and assessments that occur, and it takes it through a different process. I would always recommend and advise the council to be in the best position possible to make its own decision on a planning application and make it on its own merits without being put in a position of being on the back foot, if you like, through a VCAT process. So that would be the primary risk that might be considered by the council.
Thank you. Nothing further.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. Next, we have Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A question perhaps for Mr. Walker with regard to the driveway at the moment being 2.5 wide of the site in discussion. Can I ask if there was a willingness upon reflection of the applicant to consider the retention of the original building, could access to an underground basement be established at the front of the property where the existing driveway is at the moment, if there was adequate meterage to set back the entrance to an underground car park that then went underneath the existing driveway to the rear of the property?
Through yourself, Mayor, I'd be very reluctant to redesign a building or give design advice of that type, given the engineering and design implications of such an approach. It certainly would be a total reconsideration of how the site would work and if it was feasible, and impacts on frontages and landscaping and engineering and the like. It's quite an extensive type of proposal.
Thank you. Look, I understand it would be a whole redesign. Thank you.
Councillor Thompson, have you forgotten your light, or are you taking another?
If I can have indulgence for one further question. I think it was follow-up from Councillor Franco's with regards to clause 12 up on the screen. I believe there was mention that could be amended, and I'm wondering if that's actually, do so with trepidation and caution, because I think the clause 5507 relates to operational emissions, whereas councillors have been referring to embodied energy, which is a completely different part of the life cycle of the building, which actually doesn't reflect itself anywhere in any planning scheme in Victoria. Am I correct in that assumption?
Thanks. Through yourself, Chair. This issue is something that is an open test for future changes to ESD policies and rules. It's not something that's strongly embedded in the planning system at the moment across different councils, as I understand it. Having said that, it is often an issue that is considered and addressed in these ESD plans. Sustainability management plans often do touch on and address this, thinking in the holistic approach to ESD, but it isn't a specific requirement of the planning system.
So we can't, for want of without wanting to do policy on the run, Mr. Walker, we can't just say we would seek to have the lowest embodied energy outcome for this development, and for the applicant to justify that?
To yourself, Chair, that wouldn't be really a sustained approach that's embodied in policies and strategies and requirements in the planning scheme as it stands.
Yep.
Sorry. Please go.
I think maybe in general business there might be an opportunity to discuss this further, potentially.
Mr. Storer, I noticed your light's on too. You want to refer to that particular?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I was just going to, I guess, pick up the point being raised by Councillor Thompson and make the point that really planning permit conditions need to have a head of power, so there needs to be a legitimate reference in the Planning Environment Act or the planning scheme, which then gives rise to the legitimacy of those conditions. And I would just question whether or not in this case introducing a condition about reuse of materials in relation to embodied energy has any head of power in the planning scheme, which I think is the question you're really asking. And I guess I would just raise a real concern about the sustainability, I shouldn't use that word, sorry, the sustainability of that condition if it were to be tested.
Perhaps if I just add one more point to that just highlights that very point again. As discussed earlier and answered in earlier questions, the applicant has a right to seek or obtain a demolition permit for that building now. And any decision you make in relation to the planning permit could be totally undermined by the fact that the building can be demolished lawfully and legitimately without even before or even if you make that planning permit decision.
It's fair to say, Mr. Walker, that building will be demolished subject to the applicant acting on the building permit.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson. Councillor Biggar is next.
Yes, thank you. I just have two follow-up questions to issues that have been raised by other councillors. One is about whether or not, thinking about the question around if a decision, say, were not to be made, and so by council, so with the applicant were to proceed to VCAT, do officers feel that the conditions that are that are currently proposed tonight are important, meaning that they would be an important loss were that to happen? Or is that not a sense that they're significant changes?
Again, through yourself, Chair, and I perhaps don't want to get into too much speculation about what conditions might be challenged at VCAT or other places. Generally, there is an opportunity for conditions that are imposed to be challenged at VCAT, and often applicants will take that course of action if they are already in a position where they are attending VCAT.
Yeah, fair enough. I understand your desire to not speculate. I guess it was just because of your previous comment that made me just want to follow up that. But fair enough. And and there wouldn't actually be any conditions were we to not were the decision to lapse, right? Anyway, to go to the second, that answers it plenty. Thank you very much. To go to follow up with Councillor Franco's question about parking, can I just ask what's the minimum requirement at this? On this application for 15 apartments?
The standard car parking requirement for this proposal is 26 car parking spaces, and it's based on the planning scheme requirement for 1 car parking space per 1 and 2 bedroom dwelling and 2 car parking spaces per 3 and 4 and above bedroom dwellings.
So at 40, it's obviously a significantly over that minimum. So just to ask, because I know you said that earlier in response to the question, it was sort of a future policy change. Does that mean that we don't have the ability right now to, for instance, condition a maximum number of parking spaces? Because obviously you might be looking at one underground basement rather than 2 if you're talking about 26 spots versus 40. So I'm just querying.
Through yourself, Chair, this is an interesting space. There is not a car parking maximum within the planning scheme, and the tools within the planning scheme are reasonably limited about taking a strong position on maximum car parking outcomes for new developments unless those tools were built into a car parking overlay that might apply to a particular location. That's something that the council could consider and could develop for a place like Camberwell. So to take a strong position against a proposal in terms of providing too many car parking spaces may not be a sustainable position. Having said that, if it is clearly demonstrated that it is way beyond the needs for the proposal, then there may be an argument in reducing the number of car parking spaces for a proposal. So it's an open question. It's one that is a matter of consideration at a future forum if it was to be tested, and it is a condition that could be included in a proposal like this, but starts getting a little bit tricky in terms of the depth of the strength of the planning tools that are available.
Okay, thank you very much.
Councillor Biggar. Councillor Franco.
It's quick.
Can I just go to Councillor Park because you've already had a go. Councillor Park.
Thank you, Chair. The Mayor asked the Director about risk in deferring this decision. I'd be interested to hear whether the Director sees any reason to defer the decision or any benefit to be derived therefrom.
Again, through yourself, Chair, and this comes down to what is before you this evening is an application for a planning permit in relation to the development of the site, and that has been assessed against the relevant planning tools. The recommendation before you is to support it based on that assessment against those tools. There is little that is open to a further discussion that creates concern or challenges against those relevant tests and considerations. So on that basis, there is no reason from the officer point of view to defer the matter this evening.
Park, you. Councillor Franco.
Thank you. Just a couple of detailed questions arising from discussion previously. Are sustainability measures possible to be included in the demolition permits that are issued by the responsible authority? Is that something that ever occurs?
Simple answer to that, no. The building permits for demolition are generally issued by private building surveyors. Council can issue a demolition permit if applicants seek the demolition permit from council. However, no, those sustainability requirements are not included within those within the building system in demolition permits.
And one other, I presume the answer is yes, but I just want to be absolutely clear. A demolition permit, or building permit for demolition, can be issued in the absence of an approved proposal for a site.
Again, through yourself, Chair, absolutely. There is no reason why a permit couldn't have been issued for the demolition of this property, for example, today, before this decision this evening.
Thank you.
No further questions are here. So, Councillor Gillies, you had foreshadowed a motion. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. If the officers would be kind enough to put that up on the screen, please.
Is this the...
Then everyone can read it. Thank you.
So you're moving that motion, which is not the officer's recommendation, correct?
Correct.
Thank you, Councillor Gillies. Do I have a seconder?
Mr. Chair, for the benefit of the gallery, it might be worth speaking to what that is, just to highlight, because it is quite different from the officer's recommendation.
Well, would you like me to read the recommendation? The new recommendation that Councillor Gillies has put forward is that the Urban Planning Delegated Committee resolve to defer number one, to defer consideration of the application to allow council officers and the applicant to explore retention of the existing building with a focus on environmental sustainability and reduction of carbon emissions. Number two, that the officers draw the applicant's attention to the objectives of Council's Climate Action Plan, the Planning and Environment Act of 1987, and the Burundara Planning Scheme, recognising the carbon emissions associated with demolition of an existing building and replacement with a new building are not consistent with these documents, that a further report be submitted to the Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting to be held on the 6th of March 2023 to advise the status of discussions and a recommendation for resolution of the application. So that is what we have for us, but I will look for a seconder before we do anything else. Do I have a seconder?
I'm happy to second that.
I have a seconder in Councillor Gold. And to assist the mover, is anybody opposed? Councillor Park. I'll record your opposition. There is a number, but at least. Thank you. Well, we have opposition. Could you then, Councillor Gillies, speak to your motion?
Thank you, Chair. The Australian Government has committed to meeting a national target of recovering 80% of our waste by the year 2030. The National Waste Report, in fact the latest, tells us that in the year 2020 to 21, the country's largest waste stream again was from construction and demolition, and nearly all of it was sent to landfill. State planning systems and the National Code for Construction are moving to emphasise energy reduction. The City of Melbourne has developed a suite of initiatives, including a zero-carbon building retrofit team. This move requires more than fitting out buildings with improved design. It extends to reducing the drain on natural resources, ecological waste, resource recovery and ideologies of reusing and repurposing. Expectations we've clearly heard from our community. Although the planning permit assessment doesn't require reusing materials from a demolished building or refurbishment of an existing one, the Burundara Planning Scheme and Climate Action Plan look to our municipality to respond and implement strategies specifically reducing carbon emissions. I quote from the Government's Department of Climate Change, Energy, Environment and Water. Finding ways to reuse, reduce and recycle construction waste will be essential to the sustainability of the construction industry. Associate Professor in Construction at Melbourne University, Dr. Robert Crawford, tells us that from an environmental perspective, it is almost always better to retrofit. Existing buildings have a significant amount of resources embedded in them in the form of raw materials, energy and water. Whilst the property at 570 Riversdale Road doesn't comply with individual heritage protection, it does present an opportunity for a commercial developer to be at the forefront of ESD progress and lead by example. Here is an opportunity to refurbish a large, solid brick building with its terrazzo floors, balconies and spacious interiors, well sited in a garden setting with ample potential development space behind it. I'm advocating for an opportunity to engage in less destruction and more enhancing construction. Buildings of this ilk demonstrate character and livability that many would argue offer highly desirable appeal. A quick Google of Armidale, Windsor, Paran and Malvern properties can confirm that. We're looking at a massive demolition. It's 3 stories of solid brick with all the waste and negative environmental impacts that involves for a net housing gain of 6 apartments on a site of over 2,000 square metres. Where, I ask you, is the justification that such a building needs to be demolished? Now, I understand that we've heard tonight about the planning scheme challenges, and I understand my colleagues may not necessarily see a statutory enforceable position for this application. However, I call on the developer to work with council officers and revisit the application with a view to retrofitting the existing building. And I call on my colleagues to support a deferment to allow that conversation to be offered and to support an opportunity to demonstrate our commitment to reducing carbon emissions. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Gillies. Councillor Gold, as the seconder, do you wish to speak now or reserve your right?
I have nothing further to add to the excellent case put by Councillor Gillies tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gold. Councillor Park, as the Does any other councillor wish to speak? Councillor Thompson.
Thanks, Chair. Look, I certainly understand where the mover of this motion is coming from, and I certainly agree that this council needs to move towards the whole of building life cycle carbon abatement. That includes operational, but also it includes the non-operational and the embodied energy. There's lots of studies through the UK, through Germany, that the demolition and the construction of a new building contributes up towards 20 to 30% of the greenhouse carbon gases as part of the greenhouse emissions of the construction industry. It's certainly an area that we should create a policy around. If it's not through the association with the other councils, it's something that we need to do ourselves. It aligns with our strategies, with our climate action plan. But where I land on this one, unfortunately, is that we can't do that for this project. We can do it for future projects if we get our skates on, and obviously we require officers to actually help craft this mechanism in the planning scheme. But at the moment, we don't have that. I'm at a loss here because on one hand, this motion seeks to retain a building that we've already consented to demolish. And absent of a rescission to pull back that consent, and it sounds like from what Mr Walker said previously, it's not something that we can do. Unfortunately, we've already arrived at a decision that this building is not worthy of retention. That's this council's position. There's no moving away from that. We've already resolved that this building can be demolished. So it's the application of whether it's a new building or whether it's just a paddock. That's what's in front of us at the moment. There's nothing more than that, unfortunately. I don't like where we are, but it is where we are. There's nothing we can do about it. The proposal design, I think one of the most important things that I heard tonight, given what we've heard on a number of things, was the applicant accepts all the conditions on this report. The architects, Rothy Lohman, are exceptional architects. There will be a beautiful architectural piece constructed, and maybe in 80 to 100 years' time, the future council might say that this is worthy of a heritage protection, much like Eric Humphreys was the developer of that land in the first place. I'll come back to my first point for everyone's benefit. We've already consented to the demolition of this property. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Councillor Thompson. Next we have Councillor Watson.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be opposing this motion tonight. Councillor Gillies has presented a motion which is a piece of advocacy work that ignores the current regulatory framework that our applicant has complied with. And I direct the attention of fellow councillors to the score on the best tool of 59%. So this applicant has turned their attention to the ESD and has gone above and beyond the 50%, and that's to be commended. I won't echo what Councillor Thompson has already said because I think the comments certainly stand for themselves. We have got council positions on this building, and it would not be good governance to suddenly, as a council, be making decisions based on advocacy, based on what we'd like to see in the future. That's entirely unfair to applicants who work within the guidelines and the statutory obligations which are before them. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't advocate for change and things that are consistent with policies that we have in place. But for tonight, for this application, I will not be supporting the motion before us, and I'll encourage my fellow councillors to do likewise.
Thank you, Councillor Watson. Next, we have Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you, Chair. There's lots of ideas in the three-part motion on the screen that have merit. And I applaud Councillor Gillies for thinking outside the box to try and do something to A, protect Rotherwood, but B, take a step forward in sustainability and do what we can to allow these beautiful buildings to last longer and send less to landfill. The suggestions are great. However, as Councillor Thompson said and Councillor Watson said, this is not in our remit to do this tonight. This is not the conversation that we're having. The application before us is for a very sound development that meets a whole heap of standards and guidelines, and I think it's unfair to try and unpick that at this point when we're so far down the road. I would absolutely suggest that many of these points in the three-part motion on the screen that have great merit ought to be raised in general business, and we should take this step forward for sustainability. I think that's the right thing to do, but now is not the right time. Councillor Gillies could utilise that opportunity tonight, or, with the benefit of time, put something together with officers and do it at a future meeting. There's no requirement to necessarily do that tonight, but it could be done. VCAT is a difficult place to take this to, where we may very well find that our community has a worse outcome than what is proposed by officers and recommended by our officers tonight. Officers have looked at this proposal and put together a set of conditions to give our community the best outcome they can within the statutory framework that exists. And I would encourage my colleagues tonight to consider the due diligence done by officers tonight and their recommendation before us. Should the motion on the screen fail, I will happily move the officers' recommendation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. Next is Councillor Biggar.
Thank you. I have to say I'm very, I suppose like many councillors tonight, I feel myself in a very frustrated situation. Thank you, Councillor Gillies, for this motion. I do understand the sentiment behind it. I understand that a part of our role is about listening to the concerns of community. Clearly, there's certainly community here and community who've written to us who are concerned about this building. But my frustration comes from the fact that I don't think we, as I think the paper has shown us and our discussion tonight, I think revealed, unfortunately, that's not the discussion we're having tonight about whether or not this building can be demolished. And so given the discussion that we are having and the reality of that, I unfortunately won't be able to support this motion. I do want it to be, as others have said, the beginning of a different discussion for us about, so that we're not continually saying, well, next time. And particularly for me, for one thing, thinking about things like that other communities have started to do in places like Camberwell Junction is to think about maximum parking spaces, for example, or certainly about some of our demolition issues that we've discussed tonight. So I don't need to repeat what others have said, but I suppose the main word for me tonight is frustration.
Thank you, Councillor Biggar. Next we have Councillor Franco.
Thank you. Like Councillor Thompson, Councillor Sinfield, Councillor Biggar, I echo the same views. It's a very difficult situation to be in. I would love to be able to see the Brotherwood Flats preserved, restored. I'd love to see them as part of a heritage precinct, even if they're not individually significant at that, reaching that level with the neighbouring flats. But that's not the case, and that's not the situation before us. And unfortunately, while some of the sentiments behind the motion on the screen are understandable, they won't achieve the outcomes they're designed. They simply won't work. They're effectively platitudes, and we don't have any power to do these things. I do think, as my colleagues have said, there's a learning opportunity here and an opportunity to go forward in future so that we don't hopefully find ourselves in this situation in future, bringing forward the work on our ESD plans as well, looking at other issues, our car parking rates. I do think other municipalities in very dense urban areas have a very different approach to car parking, imposing maximums rather than, say, requiring minimums. Now, there are areas of our municipality, such as around Camberwell Junction, where I think our philosophical approach to these issues needs to change to be consistent with our environmental outlook. It's the first time I've actually heard here in this chamber a member of the community come forward, Mr. Cardillo, and actually put that case. And I was just delighted to hear a member of the community come forward and put that case. I wish we could do something about it in this application, but we can't because of the planning controls. And VCAT, this matter will simply end up in VCAT. It'll be approved instantly. Councillor Thompson made the point. Councillor's already made given the consent to its demolition. Look, it's a very, very painful situation, but I can't support the motion in its current form. And I hope we do use the opportunity to go forward in future. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Franco. Councillor Park is next.
Thank you, Chair. As I've indicated, I won't support the motion. The fact is that councillors come to this environment not all-powerful, but subject to the Local Government Act, the Planning and Environment Act, our planning scheme, and all of those in concert set out matters that can be considered. And of course, the common law makes it clear what matters can't be considered. And one doesn't come along here to seek out applause and to have 60 seconds of popularity. And what I said earlier about relevance, whilst the message wasn't well received, the fact is that it doesn't matter how well-meaning members of the community are, if they can't actually focus on matters that can be taken into account by the decision makers, then the arguments will always come to naught. And councillors can sit here and say they feel frustrated, but at the end of the day, this was a relatively straightforward application that should have taken next to no time to consider. That's the fact of the matter. It may be, an inconvenient truth to borrow that term, but that's the fact of the matter. Yet we've wasted hours. I mean, if there's genuinely a concern about some of the matters being addressed at the policy level, then devote your energy in the correct forum and do something about it. Otherwise, it's just chest beating that's never ever going to get anywhere. And clearly this motion will be defeated based on the speakers that we've heard thus far. But the fact is, it would come to naught because the developer's representative has made it very clear that there's no point in such discussions. Their position's clear, and I think their position's perfectly reasonable. We see many lacklustre applications before council. This isn't one of those. I agree with what Councillor Thompson said. I think this development application actually stacks up reasonably well. And the officers have made the point that the urban designer describes the design concept as well conceived and executed architectural scheme that contributes positively to the streetscape and wider public realm. There was discussion about the pin oak tree. That's being protected and preserved. So there's a lot of ado about nothing. And surely it's not too much to expect that we can actually focus on developing policy in the correct forum. The correct forum isn't when we're considering a planning application like this. As the CEO reminded councillors, there needs to be a head of power. Absent that, then it all comes to nothing. So if those who've spoken wishing to see a change actually focus on doing it in the right way and seek to engage the community rather than mislead them and let them think, oh, well, if we put up a motion like this and pass it, that magically everything's going to be okay, it simply won't be. It really is that simple. And in saying that, I make no criticism of Councillor Gillies. I know that she's well-intentioned, but the fact is, what's before us has only one outcome.
Thank you, Councillor Park. Councillor Hollingsworth is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Look, I certainly listened to all comments of all councillor colleagues. There was aspirations at the start of this meeting to hope that the applicant, listening to the commentary, may consider the merits of doing all that could be done to retain the property with some very clever design elements where a large extension could be done at the rear. I had hoped that there'd be a willingness to take the challenge, the architectural challenge, of working on a hero project, a flagship project, a legacy project that could be one of the first in Boroondara to go above and beyond our planning framework to retain a building and demonstrate not only can it be retained, but it can be trained in a way that it can be complementary and adapted to an extension at the rear. This particular block of land is a huge site. It's in excess of 2,000 square metres. There's adequate provision to still increase the overall footprint, enhance landscape, and achieve a high-quality urban design that recognises the importance of sustainability, that acknowledges that with the National Construction Code that is going to be enhanced and implemented in the months to come, the objectives are to identify performance solutions, requirements, and deem to satisfy the commitment to sustainability in design. So whilst I agree with the comments tonight that this particular motion may not achieve the desired outcome, I do commend Councillor Gillies for putting it forward. And I believe that the debate tonight has been well interrogated and all comments have been very valid, and certainly we will be pursuing the matters discussed at greater detail. I would like to see the officers continue dialogue with the applicant. I would like the officers to encourage the applicant to listen to the commentary tonight and consider every possibility of preserving this building. So I will be supporting Councillor Gillies. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Hollingsworth. Next, we have Councillor Addis.
Thanks very much, Chair. A lot's been said, and I think really all I want to say is good on you, Councillor Gillies, for having a go. You listened to your community and I know you've worked really hard to try and find a way to achieve what so many people would like to see as the outcome, and I suspect, in truth, so would many of us in here like to see that outcome. It seems it's not going to be possible, and we need to just accept the sad truth, the inconvenient truth of this is where we are. We have a planning scheme that isn't of our making, that in many ways we don't support, but it's what we work within. And I also wanted to thank the officers. Again, it's a really good report that that canvasses the complexity of the situation and has put a lot of work into analysing it and talks about all the important things like, you know, can we protect it on heritage grounds as many of us would like to? And I think sort of kindly tries to find a way through it, but in the end, there isn't one. So we accept where we are, and we certainly, I think, do want to achieve better outcomes in future properties. It's just not going to happen with this one. But again, thank you, Councillor Gillies.
Thank you, Councillor Addis. And before I pass on to the mover, I might make some comments myself. Clearly, this has been extremely well debated by councillors. I think you should be commended for really turning out all the issues and the community, the way that they presented, and also the officers assisting us with wise expert advice. Thank you for that. Look, I think this is one of those situations where we see as councillors that the Burundara community, on the one hand, has taken up initiatives to mitigate against the risk posed by greenhouse gases. We see that. And overwhelmingly, this is certainly not just virtue signalling by the community, and it does require some inconvenience and it does require personal cost and some sacrifice. We see that in the community. And many other communities are doing the same. So we well expect, it's a human thing to expect, and us as representatives to reflect what our community feels, that this kind of community expectation of contributing to climate risk mitigation should be for everyone and to play their role and in this endeavour, and includes corporate entities like developers. Am I disappointed that the developer has not chosen the high road to show that they are supporting community expectations? Of course I am. From what I hear from councillors, you all are, even though we know from the letter of the law we can't do anything about it. At a minimum, I was hoping that the developer could have actually, given their understanding of where future ESD is going, to have provided an engineering impact assessment to demonstrate that their proposal is at least not going to be contributing much more to greenhouse gases by doing some if-then analysis. That's not to be. But I do understand the difficult position they're in. Developers are in a difficult position as well, because in this space, there haven't been the appropriate, consistent, level playing field laws so that developers know they're on the same footing with the rest of the competition. So it's easy for us to say developers should take the high road, but there are costs associated. This is despite knowing, though, that we have big emissions coming from construction and demolition, as Councillor Thompson put on the table with some of the interesting concepts he highlighted. I totally understand Councillor Gillies' viewpoint. In a position that she's in, she's really done extremely well, and Councillor Addis said that really well. And trying to square the circle is not a good position to be in, and she went outside the box, but unfortunately, it's very difficult to do what we need to do because there are no laws to compel this. And as much as I sympathise with what she's trying to achieve, and it is worthy for the reasons that I outlined earlier and you all outlined, I don't think I can support that motion. On that basis, I will pass it on to you, Councillor Gillies, to round up the debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and I thank my colleagues for their comments. And although there appears to be little hope of a reprieve on this particular property, I believe we have heard a strong desire around the chamber to strengthen policies for the future. And I look forward to seeing them being furthered in the near future. We have opportunity here to examine where we can create enforceable and defendable situations in our policies, and I look forward to progressing that. Thank you, Chair.
Now I will put the motion. Those in favour? Those opposed? The motion has failed. Councillor Sinfield, you foreshadowed that you would be willing to move another motion?
Not strictly, but I am very happy to move the officer's recommendation.
Sorry, did I misunderstand early on that you had foreshadowed?
No, it's absolutely fine. I spoke to it.
I'm happy to move it.
I'm happy if you don't want to move it to move it.
No, it's fine. I'm happy to move it.
You are happy?
Yes, I'm happy.
So be moved. Do I have a seconder?
Yeah, I'm happy to second that.
Sorry, Councillor Puck, I have Councillor Thompson up on the screen.
If you check your screen, I think I was up there first, but I don't mind. Either way.
Come on. Councillor Park, you seconded. You're the seconder. So, to assist the mover, is there any opposition?
I'd like to ask if a minor amendment would be entertained by the mover.
I might ask. Well, let's test it. Do you want to put your... Councillor Sinfield, would you be
She probably wants to know what I'm referring to.
I'm happy to hear a suggestion. It's unlikely that...
It's unlikely, but look, if you scroll down to 12A and a 12B, that would read something to the effect of 12B, the recycling and reuse of the materials of the existing building.
Chair, I won't accept that as an amendment to this motion. I feel it's outside our remit at this point.
Councillor Franco, do you want to move an amendment?
Look, I'll let it go. I don't think there's...
Thank you. That's probably at this time of the day. So there being no opposition, I will now put the motion.
Sorry, Chair. We moved very quickly and I didn't get a chance to put my light on, but I will be in opposition.
We have opposition. Okay. Councillor Sinfield, could you speak to your motion?
Thank you, Chair. I think the debate's largely been had and I don't think we really need to revisit all of the points already raised. I thank Councillor Franco for the suggestion, and while it's admirable, I think it's outside our remit at this point in time, so I'm happy for the motion to be put.
I think...
I'm happy to move that the motion's put.
I will make this... I will put the motion and ask councillors to whether you supporting the putting of the motion. Yep, I see support there. Show of hands, please. Yep, we'll put the motion then. The motion is put. Those in favour of the motion that Councillor Sinfield has put up? Those against? Motion's passed. Thank you, councillors. Whilst we were speaking, we had a very late submitter that would like to have spoken, but they submitted far too late, and under Section 88, I would not allow their submission to be heard. So now we'll move to item number 4. Our substantive agenda has finished. General business. Is there any general business, councillors? Councillor Thompson.
I know Councillor Gillies might add to this, but we've had substantial debate on sustainability, and I think the officers have probably garnered not only operational but embodied energy within the planning scheme. It would be advantageous if there could be a future CB&D discussion on how we can actually resolve tightening up the planning scheme, or an update on the discussions that are happening with the other 23 councils, with the intent to strengthen our planning position, aligning with our climate action plan.
That sounds like a great idea. Any other general business? Councillor Gillies?
Thank you, Chair. Effectively the same.
Thank you. No further general business. Urgent business.
I had an item.
Apologies, indeed. I've got to take the training wheels off. Councillor Sinfield first, and then Councillor...
Thanks, Chair. Well, I think officers can probably go away and work on the sentiment of tonight's meeting. I have sent through a form of words where the council wanted to resolve formally to request a report, but it's largely unnecessary, I think, at this point.
Thank you, Councillor Sinfield. Councillor Gold.
My comments were similar to Councillor Thompson's comments, but just expand it slightly. There's already motions in place. We're working with 23 other councils to achieve certain things. I don't know if it's the same stuff that's going on within Casby, but I'd like to see what we're approaching, what we're trying to achieve at this point in time. And the addition I'd make to that, is there anything else we should be pursuing at this point in time, given the sentiments raised tonight? And so I support a proposal to bring it to a CB&D. What are we doing now, and do we need to go further than that to meet our climate action plan? Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gold. It sounds like a holistic sort of paper for CB&D. Thank you for that. Councillor Franco.
Thanks. There are three issues I'd like to see addressed in future. One is the issue of car parking rates in our urban centres such as Camberwell Junction, and a potential discussion around that. That's not an issue that's addressed, I don't think, in any of the ESD policy per se, nor even in our climate action plan, but it's a planning control matter that is related to our environmental outlook and our climate change plan, and perhaps at some point that could be a subject for CB&D at the appropriate time. Another one, and I almost would like three. The other one is related, is the use of the prohibition of car parking permits for new apartments in a more, and the extent to which, I know this has come up and I've raised it, but to the extent to which council can ensure that new developments are not entitled to car parking, on-street car parking permits, and strengthening the controls around that. That may be a separate discussion. And thirdly, the issue of buildings being demolished before planning permits are approved, and whether there's any scope in not seeing that occur. I don't know to what extent individual councils have any power in that. Oh, look, this may be an answer that could be given right now. Is that something that any council can take action on? Certainly in other jurisdictions, some councils have taken measures, I know from first-hand knowledge, to prevent that occurring.
Could I suggest perhaps something? And I think all of the issues been raised are really good, and in some ways this particular development obviously brought the creative juices in everyone. Thank you, Councillor Gillies, for starting the ball rolling. But perhaps we can give officers direction outside the meeting, rather than bringing everything in this meeting, to provide anything that we wish to see in this holistic report, because it does sound to be there's a desire for that report to come to CB&D. Would that make sense? I will pass on to that. Yep. Councillor Franco? Yep.
Thank you. That's fine, Chair.
Thank
Chair,
you.
Just on that point, could I just make the suggestion that sometimes these sorts of discussions are better held at the workshop forums rather than CB&D, because, I mean, it's all well and good to task officers with all these issues, but until we actually get some sense of what it is that we're seeking to do and achieve, it seems to be a bit cart before the horse. So, again, it's not for decision tonight, but I just think some serious consideration ought to be given about the forum, because for some of this CB&D will work, but others, it needs a discussion.
You may well be spot on, Councillor Park, but I think hopefully with the initial bringing of the paper, all the threads will be hopefully teased out, and we'll find the relative forms for all of them. I'm hoping. Okay. One can always hope. Councillor Sinfield, you have...
an item of urgent business when you're ready to move on.
When ready, okay. Well, if there's no more... sorry? We have our CEO would like to speak as well. Sorry about that. I can't see that well at the back.
That's
there.
fine. Thank you, Mr Chair. I just wanted to build on what Councillor Park has said. there are two issues, I think. One is that you'll have a much better discussion if you have it in a forum which is really focused on you being strategic. The other thing is that before we go off and spend considerable resources doing things and chasing rabbits down burrows that not all of you want us to chase down those burrows, we should really understand the level of support for some of the things which have been said. So I think a general discussion first in a forum where we test all of that and then we go off and do the detail which aligns up with what the majority of you would like us to do is probably the best way forward.
Thank you, Mr. Storer. That sounds like a wise idea. Next, I think there's no more general business. Urgent business, Councillor Sinfield.
Thank you, Chair. Section 20 of our governance rules allows for urgent business, and it's my recommendation that this ought to be admitted as urgent, as it cannot be deferred until the next meeting due to an impending VCAT hearing commencing on the 13th of February.
Sure. Do you want to describe the item so that we can ask the councillors whether it would be admitted as urgent business?
It relates to 76 Wattle Road in Hawthorn, and my proposed motion is on the screen. It's a letter to the Minister for Planning. Yep.
I'm happy to second that being moved into urgent business.
Wonderful. Let's have a mover and a seconder. So the motion is then, would you like to speak to your motion? Oh, is there any opposition?
I think we might need to vote on it being admitted as urgent business.
Oh, first admitted, yeah. I think we have it. It's urgent business, yes. Now, would you like to move that motion?
Thank you, Chair. So the substantive motion is a motion to write to Minister Sonia Kilkenny in relation to 76 Wattle Road in Hawthorn, as on the screen. I can elaborate further if colleagues would like me to. I did circulate it late this evening, and I believe that there's heritage value in the property, and I think it's prudent to advocate on behalf of our community for the Minister to reconsider this matter.
I'm happy to second that.
For the benefit of the mover, is there any opposition? There being no opposition, Councillor Sinfield, would you briefly speak to your motion?
Thanks. I think it's largely been said. I've met with members of the community this week and previously, and I've discussed this matter with officers. So too has the ward councillor, Councillor Bigger, and I think that it's the appropriate thing to do to simply write to the Minister and ask her personal reconsideration of this matter.
Thank you. Councillor Thompson, seconder? No. Nothing to further. No. Having nothing to add, further to add, let me put the motion. Councillors, those for? It's unanimous. It's been passed. Thank you very much. We are now at the close of the meeting then, but before I close the meeting, I want to thank you all who have joined us this evening and wish you all and your family good health. I declare the Urban Planning Delegated Committee meeting closed. Thank you very much.